Late at night on August 15th, 2019, two police officers in England were driving in an unmarked police car along this narrow, winding road when all of a sudden, right in front of them, another car came bombing down the road towards them. And so both cars came to a screeching stop, and then one occupant from this other car got out of their vehicle, and one of the officers got out of their vehicle. What happened next was so horrific that a special law was passed to make sure it never happened again. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please remove the prong in all of the like button's belts. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On July 18th, 2019, 28-year-old Andrew Harper scrawled a little note inside of a card, and then he folded the card up, he slipped it into its envelope, and he handed that envelope off to a nearby friend. And this friend, after getting this envelope and Andrew's directions for what to do with it, he left Andrew's room and began walking down the hall all the way towards the other side of the Ardington house. The Ardington house, where they were staying, is this beautiful mansion built in the 1700s that sits on about 30 acres of gardens and parklands, and it's located about an hour west of London in the English countryside. Once Andrew's friend, with this letter in hand, had walked all the way across the mansion and had found the room he was looking for, he gently knocked on the door, and then after being led inside, he made his way right over to 28-year-old Lizzie Beckett, and he handed her the envelope. Lizzie and Andrew had grown up in the same town of Wallingford, which is a small rural town about 10 miles away from where they were, the Ardington house. And from the time Lizzie and Andrew had met each other when they were 15 years old, they had become totally inseparable. It was truly love at first sight. And now, 13 years later, they were finally getting married. And so Lizzie, after getting this envelope, she saw the writing on the outside of it and knew it was from her fiancé. And so she smiled, she opens up this letter, and she reads what's inside. And it just said, "Life is slippery. Here, take my hand." While on the surface, this little note seemed like nothing more than a romantic gesture from Andrew, in reality, those 7 words contained in that card were a great representation of who Andrew really was. He was a protector. Ever since Lizzie could remember, Andrew had always been so concerned with her safety. And for that matter, anybody around Andrew was just worried about and wanted to make sure everybody was taken care of. And as Andrew got older and grew to be this massive 6'5" tall man, his natural inclination to protect other people only became more pronounced. While Andrew was known for being incredibly charming and friendly and approachable, at a moment's notice, he could flip the switch and literally step in and use his big frame to protect anybody that needed protecting, no questions asked. And so it came as no shock to Lizzie, or really anybody who knew Andrew, when Andrew, at the age of 19, became a special constable or volunteer police officer for the Thames Valley Police Department. This police department was the same one that oversaw Wallingford, where he and Lizzie had grown up, and also the surrounding areas. And just a year after becoming a special constable, Andrew had done such an amazing job that he was hired on by the Thames Valley Police Department to be a regular constable, so a full-fledged police officer. And over the following years that he was a regular constable, Andrew's hard work and dedication would quickly make him one of the most well-respected and well-liked police officers on the force. In fact, just a few weeks before he sent off that letter to Lizzie on the day of their wedding, Andrew had been promoted. He had been assigned to the road policing unit within the Thames Valley Police Department, and what that meant was, in addition to a host of new responsibilities on a day-to-day basis, Andrew would now become one of the police officers who would immediately respond to any emergency call that came in. He was basically a front lines police officer now. And so, of course, this meant Andrew's job just became a lot more dangerous. But for Andrew, that didn't matter at all, because to him, the most important thing was protecting people in need. And so this promotion just gave him a bigger opportunity to do that. And so Lissy, after reading this little note that Andrew had just sent her, she set it down on the table, and now with a big grin on her face, she finished getting ready, and then that afternoon, she and Andrew would walk down the aisle, and they would say, "I do," in front of their families and their closest friends, and then that evening, after the newlyweds had had their first dance as a married couple, they would tell each other that this was the happiest day of their lives. 28 days later, on August 15th, Andrew, along with his partner, who also was named Andrew, his name was Andrew Shaw, they were conducting a surveillance operation in a town called Reading. Reading is a town about 30 minutes south of Wallingford. Just after 11 p.m., the men finally decided it was time to shut down their operation and head back home. Their shift had actually ended 4 hours earlier, but being hardworking and diligent police officers, they had worked overtime because they knew it would help their unit. But now at 11 p.m., they were totally exhausted, and so as they're kind of yawning and packing up their things, Shaw, who was driving, would fire up the engine of the unmarked BMW car they were in, and then once it was on, he would pull away from the curb, and they would start heading north. At the same time, a very distressed man who lived not far from where Andrew and Shaw had just been doing surveillance, he called 999 and he told the dispatcher that just a few moments ago, this gray sedan had pulled up his driveway and stopped right outside of his property. Now, this man's property was off of a road called Admore Lane, which was this winding one-lane country road that had very little traffic, and there was not that many properties off of it. And so for anybody to pull on to this man's property would have caught his attention, let alone a car pulling onto his property in the middle of the night. And so as soon as the man had seen these headlights coming up his driveway, he had gone to the window and watched, wondering, what is this person doing? Had they turned onto the wrong property? Are they going to turn around and leave? But to his horror, once this car had stopped right outside of his house, 3 masked men who were carrying weapons of some kind got out of the vehicle. And so at that point, the man had frantically dialed 999, and as he's trying to describe the situation to the dispatcher, he suddenly tells the dispatcher, as he's looking out the window, that he thinks these men are here to steal his quad bike. His quad bike was parked right outside of his detached garage, and he saw them walking towards it. And so he tells the dispatcher, who's already told him that police are on the way, he tells the dispatcher, "I can't wait any longer. I'm going out to confront them and stop them from stealing my bike." The dispatcher yells at him not to and says, "They have weapons. Stay in your house." But this guy's not listening. And so he runs to his front door. He opens the front door up. But by the time he's looking outside, the gray car, the 3 masked men, they're all gone. And so too is his quad bike. And so he goes back in the house, he's talking to the dispatcher, and the dispatcher says, "Look, just stay at your house. The police are on the way. They will intercept that car. They'll get your quad bike back." And so seconds later, a call went out over the radio to Thames Valley Police to go and intercept this gray car on Admore Lane. So whoever was closest, go over there. But be advised, the occupants of this car are 3 masked men that are armed and dangerous. Now, Andrew and Shaw, when they heard this call, they would have known that they were not the only officers that could have taken this call. And they also would have known that they've been off the clock now for like 4.5 hours. There was no expectation that they would continue to work and go take this call. But they didn't care at all. When that call came across, the only thing they thought about was, do your job. And so Shaw, he whips the car around and he speeds towards Admore Lane and he pulls off of the main road called the A4. He gets onto Admore Lane and he starts driving north. Now, as soon as they turned onto that road, their vehicle effectively blocked the way for anybody coming the other direction. And so at this point, they're expecting this gray car full of these masked men to be coming in their direction, and they are now blocking the way. And so Andrew and Shaw, as soon as they get on that road, they know a close quarters confrontation is almost guaranteed. But when you listen to the dash cam footage from the front of their vehicle that picked up the voices of Andrew and Shaw as they turn onto this road, there is no nerves, there's no fear, there's no hesitation. They are calm as can be. This is what they have trained for. They were ready. And so Shaw, he's making his way up this winding road. It's totally pitch black. The trees are practically on top of the road. It's like a tunnel of trees. And so they're driving along this road, and then all of a sudden, up in the distance, you can see on the dash cam footage, you you see headlights bombing toward them. They're way off in the distance, and then all of a sudden, that car, these headlights, they come flooring out right in front of them, and both cars come to a screeching stop. You can hear the screeching of the brakes on the dash cam footage. And so this car in front of them comes to a full stop, and Shaw, he stops, but then he moves up just a little bit closer before fully stopping the car. And so now the two cars are only maybe 10 or 15 feet apart. At this point, it's important to understand that the vehicle that Shaw and Andrew were in was an unmarked car, and they had intentionally not put on their blue lights as they're cruising up this road because they didn't want the suspects to see the blue lights in the distance and turn around and get away. And so now they've come face to face, and so Andrew and Shaw, they're looking at this vehicle, and they can see that one, it's a gray sedan, so it matches the description of the car they're looking for, and two, behind this gray sedan is what looks like a quad bike that they are towing. And so they know this is the car they were looking for. It's on Admore Lane. This is going to be it. And so Shaw, he flips on the blue lights, and Andrew, who's in the passenger seat, he opens the door and begins yelling at the occupants to stay where they are. But they don't listen, because now the masked men in the gray car, they know they've been caught. There's police right in front of them. And so suddenly, one of the masked men in the back seat of this car, he leaps out of the vehicle and he runs around to the back of the gray car and he unhooks the quad bike. And then the gray car, without even waiting for this third masked man to get back inside, it just begins driving forward on the left side of Shaw and Andrew, basically trying to drive around them, despite the fact there's nowhere to drive. It's a ditch on either side of the road. But obviously, these guys are desperate and willing to do anything to get away. And so this gray car has driven down into this ditch before Andrew and Shaw could do anything. And then the third masked man, who's realizing he's being left behind, he starts running around the right side of the police car. So he's trying to go around the other way. And amazingly, as soon as the third masked man made it around to the back of the police car, the gray car somehow managed to pop out of the ditch and got back onto the road, and it starts driving away from Shaw and Andrew. And as they're driving away, the third masked man is just on the road running after them. And so Andrew, seeing an opportunity to potentially grab this third masked man that was out on foot, he jumps out of the police car, he turns and starts running down the road after the suspects. And so Shaw, he doesn't have enough space on this road to turn around and drive after them. And so all he could do was put the car into reverse and then look over his shoulder and start driving in reverse after them. And so as Shaw is driving backwards down this road, he can see out of his rear window Andrew, who is chasing the third masked man, who is chasing the gray car. And so we can see all this happening out his back window. And then something totally strange that just defied logic happened. The third masked man suddenly leaps as if he's trying to jump into the moving car. And at the same time, Andrew, who's closed the distance on him, kind of lunges for the third masked man. And then just as suddenly as these two maneuvers have happened, both men just vanish, and then the gray car just drives away and disappears. And so Shaw, he's watching this happening, and he has no idea what he's just witnessed. He's thinking, where did Andrew go? Where'd the third masked man go? What's happened? But he still can only drive in reverse, and so he's just driving and driving, and then finally he reaches a point in the road that's just wide enough that he's able to turn the car around, and as he's doing that, you hear over dispatch that someone is asking Shaw, what's going on? Where are you? And all Shaw is able to say is, my partner, Andrew, has gotten out of the vehicle and I lost him. I don't know where he is. And so after Shaw has turned the vehicle around, he begins driving, now facing the proper direction. And as he's driving down this creepy dark road, you don't see anything. It's eerily quiet. Andrew's nowhere to be found. The car is nowhere to be found. The third masked man, there's no one. And so Shaw is just driving down the road, hoping that as he makes one turn or the next, he's gonna see his partner just kind of running on the road somewhere, but he doesn't. But as he's driving along, what Shaw didn't realize was that there were things in the road that belonged to Andrew. They were kind of small, so he didn't see them, but the footage would later reveal that it was almost like there was this trail of Andrew's things kind of littered all over the road. There was his wallet, then there was his badge, then there was his license and other ID cards, and then there was his glove, and then there was this piece of plastic that looked like it belonged on Andrew's vest. And then a little farther further down the road because Shaw is still driving and scanning for his partner and scanning for anything, and there's just nothing. As he's driving along, he would, in real time, notice something of Andrew's, and it was Andrew's stab vest that he wore over his chest. And so he stops the vehicle and he gets out, and again, he's on this totally pitch black road where it's weirdly quiet, and he's walking up and he grabs the vest, he comes back into his vehicle and he puts it down inside of his car, and at this point, over the radio, people are asking Shaw, what's going on? Where are you? And you hear in Shaw's voice a bit of panic as he's like, I've found Andrew's stab vest. It was on the side of the road. And he can't make sense of that. He has no idea why it's there. And dispatch, they don't know what to make of that. And so Shaw just continued driving down this road, thinking to himself, what's happening here? Meanwhile, less than a mile away at the end of Admore Lane, where it joined up with A4, which is where Andrew and Shaw had originally come in, 2 other Thames Valley police cars had arrived at that intersection. They had gone there specifically to try to intercept this gray car as they fled. And so they're sitting at this intersection and they're looking up Admore Lane and they see headlights bombing towards them. It's the gray car, and the gray car comes speeding out onto A4. It makes a hard turn and it speeds away from these 2 police cars. And so one of these 2 police cars that were waiting out on the A4, one of them takes off following the gray car. But the other police car, they stay right there because unbelievably, they had just spotted Andrew. It would turn out when Shaw first put the BMW into reverse and he began going in reverse towards his partner who was chasing the third masked man who was chasing the gray car, when he was doing that and he was watching out his back window and he saw the third masked man jump and then disappear and then Andrew disappeared, that was not a figment of his imagination. That really happened. The third masked man had attempted to jump into the moving vehicle and he had been successful. As for Andrew, why he suddenly vanished, the reason for that is truly horrific. The 3 masked men were 18-year-old Henry Long and 17-year-olds Albert Bowers and Jesse Cole. All 3 of them, prior to this night, had fairly extensive criminal records, and they proudly referred to themselves as career thieves, which basically just meant they spent all day and all night stealing from people. And so that night, they had gone out with the intention of stealing that man's quad bike. It's unclear how they knew he had a quad bike, but they definitely showed up prepared because they knew they would have to get onto his property and very quickly tow that bike out of there before the homeowner could stop them. And so they had attached this long, very thick rope to the back of their gray car. It was basically like this big loop of rope, almost like a lasso. And so when they pulled up onto that man's property, they backed up to the quad bike and they looped that stretch of rope over the handlebars of this quad bike. And then all 3 of them piled back into the gray car and they sped off with the quad bike in tow. But when they were on Admore Lane and came face to face with Andrew and Shaw and realized those are police officers and were caught, the third masked man, aka Jesse Cole, he hopped out of the gray car, he ran around to the back, and he unhooked the loop of rope from this quad bike, ditching the quad bike by the side of the road so that it would be easier for the gray car to make their getaway. And so once it was free, the gray car kind of took off without Jesse, and so Jesse ran around the cop car. But Jesse would get back up to the side of the gray car and he would leap into the window. And as soon as he was inside, and Henry, who was driving, he knew he was inside, so they're all good, Henry hit the gas. And who was standing with both feet inside of that loop of rope dangling off the back of the gray car when the gray car suddenly accelerated? Andrew Harper. Andrew was swept off of his feet as the rope grabbed onto his legs, and so his head came back and smashed into the ground, and then he was dragged for 91 seconds at an average speed of 42.5 miles per hour down Admore Lane. It was only after he had been dragged for over a mile, whipping violently side to side, smashing not only into the ground, but into trees and fence posts and shrubs, just getting destroyed on this road, that finally, when they pulled off of Admore Lane and got onto A4, that turn swung Andrew around and he smashed into a curb that dislodged him from the rope and sent him careening into traffic. At that point, one of those 2 police cars took off after the gray car in pursuit. But the other car, they saw Andrew as he was thrown off the back of the gray car and launched onto A4. Now, initially, they actually thought that the suspects were just hauling a dead deer behind them because it looked like a bloody deer carcass was dangling behind the car. But when they ran up to see what it was, they saw it was their colleague. It was Andrew. And so immediately they tried to save his life. But Andrew's injuries were catastrophic. He had been destroyed. And so Andrew Harper would die at 11:45 p.m. on the side of the A4, about 20 minutes after he and his partner had so selflessly agreed to go after this car despite the fact they didn't have to. The three killers were arrested about 1 hour after Andrew had died. A police helicopter had spotted their car parked amongst some buildings about 4 miles away from where Andrew was found. During their trial, the three teens would say they had no idea that Andrew was attached to that tow rope as they sped down Admore Lane. This is despite the fact that the prosecution, they went out and recreated the exact scene that played out on Admore Lane. They used the same car, they used the same tow rope, and they used a very lifelike dummy that was the same size as Andrew Harper. It was 6'5", 200 pounds, and they strapped it on the back of the car, and they drove the same mile stretch to see what it would be like to drive with Andrew attached to the back. And these experts that went through this recreation over and over and over again, they said the same thing. It was nearly impossible to drive the car because as soon as the dummy would start to shift one way or the other, it would tug and pull on this little gray car. And so handling this car would have been a nightmare, not to mention the fact that the sound of Andrew grinding against the cement and smashing into trees and posts would have been extremely loud. And so the prosecution attested that there was absolutely no way that those three teens wouldn't have known that there was a person connected to the back of their car. Also, the prosecution said that all along Admore Lane, they found blood on both sides of the road, high up into bushes and on trees, indicating that as Henry had driven along with Andrew behind him, he must have been swerving violently side to side, most likely, at least according to the prosecution, to try to dislodge the person that was stuck on the back of his car. But the three teens never changed their story. They also never once said they regretted what they did. They showed absolutely no remorse. And when the verdict was read, and these three teens were not found guilty of murder. They were found guilty of manslaughter, but everybody knew that was significantly better because the sentences were so much shorter. When that verdict came back, these three teens were punching the air and cheering and laughing, just making a complete spectacle out of it. And then after being led out of the courthouse with the devastated family of Andrew Harper basically watching them, they were smirking and smiling at the cameras and waving and just treating the whole thing like it was one big joke. Still to this day, none of them have apologized or expressed any regret or remorse about what happened. In fact, two of the killers, Jesse and Albert, they've come out publicly and said they're going to write a book about this crime, about killing Andrew Harper, and there's no indication that this book is being written because they feel bad. It's almost certainly being written because it's an opportunity to make money. Following the verdict, Andrew's wife, Lissy, who was totally devastated not only by the loss of her husband, but also by what she viewed as total injustice with regards to the fact that these three killers had not been convicted of murder, she would go on to lobby for years to pass a brand new law called Harper's Law that would give an automatic life sentence to any criminal that killed an emergency worker while they were committing a crime, meaning this law would not differentiate between whether it was manslaughter or murder. If you killed an emergency worker while committing a crime, you're going to jail for life. And this year, Harper's Law was passed. However, it will have no effect on the sentences of Andrew Harper's killers. Henry would be sentenced to 16 years in prison, and the other two, Albert and Jesse, would be sentenced to 13 years in prison each. All three of them will be eligible for parole by the time they are 28 years old, which is the same age that Andrew was when they killed him. So that's going to do it If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please remove the prong from all of the like button's belts. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast just called MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new, never before heard podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings. On Thursday mornings, we put up remastered audio files from our most popular YouTube videos. Again, it's just called MrBallen Podcast, and you can find it on Spotify, Amazon, Apple Podcasts, Google, basically anywhere you find your podcasts, you can find this one. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts, and the other is called MrBallen en Español. We also post near daily content on our Facebook and Snapchat pages. Those are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on all of them is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's melatonin with Radithor. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. By the beginning of 2016, everybody who lived in apartment building number 12 on Shanxi Road in the big Chinese city of Xi'an knew to stay away from the woman who lived at the end of the hall on the 15th floor. Now, they didn't know much about this woman, but what they did know about her was totally bizarre and kind of alarming. The woman, whose family name was Wu, but nobody actually knew this woman's individual name, was 43 years old and she lived alone. And from what residents could tell, nobody ever came to visit her and she almost never left her apartment. But oftentimes, residents on the 15th floor could hear this woman talking to herself very animatedly inside of her apartment, and sometimes she'd even get into these big arguments with herself where it was clear she was kind of playing the role of multiple personalities at once. But none of these things were the reason why people avoided her altogether. They avoided her because she seemed really dangerous. One day, a few months earlier, a teenage girl was walking down the hallway on the 15th floor, making her way towards her friend's apartment, when she passed by this woman's apartment door. And as soon as she walked past, the door to this woman's apartment flew open, and the woman rushed outside and began screaming incoherently. And so this teenage girl, she whips around and sees this woman, and instinctively what this girl thought was, oh my goodness, this woman is being attacked. She's running away from somebody in her apartment or something. But then very quickly it became apparent that this woman was not being attacked. She was attacking the teenage girl. So this woman, she looks at the girl and her eyes go wide and she kind of curls her hands into claws. And then she began running down the hall towards this girl. And so the girl, she begins to scream and she turns and she runs down the hall and she manages to pound on her friend's door. And her friend happened to be right behind the door. They opened it up. The girl ran inside and they shut and locked the door right as this woman came barreling into the door. And this behavior from this woman on the 15th floor was just the beginning. Following this first attack, the woman on the 15th floor would routinely barge out of her apartment and chase down young women and teenage girls that were walking past her door. Now, this woman never actually hurt anyone that she chased down and even reached in time. She just kind of scared them. And so as a result, the residents of this apartment building, including the women and young girls who had been attacked by this woman, their reaction to this was not anger or resentment or, some desire to go call the police and have this woman arrested. Instead, the residents of this building just kind of felt bad for this woman. It seemed very obvious that she was mentally unwell and probably very lonely. And so they kind of collectively decided to not call the police and instead just kind of ignore her. But sometime in early February, this woman's random attacks on young women and girls just kind of stopped. And at first, residents, especially of the 15th floor of this apartment building, were just relieved because all of a sudden you could walk down that hallway in peace again. But by the end of February, it dawned on people who lived in this apartment building that not only had this woman stopped her random attacks, but also now they couldn't even hear her inside of her apartment talking to herself, because that was something people always heard, and now her apartment was totally silent. And so pretty quickly, people became kind of worried about this woman, but nobody was willing to go knock on her door and actually make sure she was okay, because again, this woman was viewed as being kind of dangerous. I mean, she was literally jumping out of her apartment and attacking random passerbys. And so people just continued to keep their distance from this woman. And so as people did that, they began to tell themselves that, probably she just moved out without anybody noticing, and that's why she's gone quiet. But it would turn out that was not the case. Right around the time the woman on the 15th floor stopped her attacks and went silent, sometime in early February, an elevator inside of this apartment building broke down between floors 11 and 10. And so a maintenance crew was called out to fix the elevator, but when they got there, they realized they didn't have the supplies or the manpower to actually make the fix. And so a decision was made to just cut the power to this individual elevator car. And then the work crew said they'd come back in about a month when they had the right supplies and people. And sure enough, a month later, this crew came back with what they needed, and they were able to lower the broken elevator car down to floor 10, and then they opened up the doors, and they were absolutely horrified at what they saw inside of that car. It's believed that shortly after this woman on the 15th floor had one of her outbreaks and chased someone down the hall, she got into the elevator and began traveling down. And when the elevator car got between floors 11 and 10, it came to a lurching stop. But for some reason, when this happened, the woman did nothing. She didn't yell for help, she didn't scream, she didn't pound on the doors, she didn't press any buttons. She just sat in the elevator car in absolute silence. And so eventually it was discovered that one of the elevator cars in this apartment building was broken, not because the woman had called out, but probably because someone had tried to hail the elevator and it didn't come down. And so that maintenance crew was called out, but they couldn't make the repair, and so they decided to cut the power to that car and come back in a month. Now, this elevator crew had no idea there was anybody inside the elevator car because, again, this woman who was trapped in there was totally silent throughout their attempts to try to fix the car. And so after these workers cut the power to this elevator car and left, this woman was doomed. This woman just sat in silence in this elevator car with no food and no water for several days until she died of dehydration, which is one of the most agonizing and slow ways to go. Now, at some point, this woman did attempt to free herself because there were scratch marks inside the elevator indicating that she had tried to claw her way out, and her hands were totally mutilated, suggesting she really had been clawing pretty hard. But that was the only time she tried to save herself. Otherwise, she just sat there and eventually died. Last winter, me and old Sika decided to go on a surfing trip. And so naturally, we flew to Colorado and hiked to the very top of the tallest mountain we could possibly find. But unbelievably, there were no beaches up there. And so Lung and I didn't even get to go surfing. But our failed surfing trip did have a silver lining. At the top of that Colorado mountain was a cave. And in that cave, deep within the mountain, was a walrus. And if you know anything about me and old Seagull, is we love giving those walrus a good tongue lashing every chance we get. And so we took that opportunity and really laid into that stupid walrus for about 36 hours. But at the 36-hour mark, the walrus had had enough, and it got up on its flippers, and it began chasing us through the cave. And so me and Lung turned and we began running for our lives. And as we ran, we did the only thing we knew how to do. We signed up for DraftKings. Now, did that save us from the walrus? No! But did it get us jacked up about football season? Yes, it did. So jacked up, in fact, that this year we're partnering up with DraftKings to make sure all you strange, dark, and mysterious aficionados out there are kept up to date about the very best deals on the DraftKings platform. Like DraftKings' very awesome no sweat same game parlay, where if your bet loses, you get a bonus bet back in the amount of your original bet. Pretty good. There's also loads of other amazing opportunities on DraftKings, so go check it out. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. New customers use promo code MrBallen, bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets immediately. That's promo code MrBallen only at DraftKings Sportsbook. At around 5:20 p.m. on August 31st, 2007, a young couple stepped onto the beautiful sand of Yelpo Beach, which is located at the very southern tip of South Korea. The couple grabbed each other's hands and smiled in excitement as they looked out on the water and saw all these fishing boats that dotted the horizon, and then behind them were all these beautiful mountains. I mean, this was a spectacular place. They couldn't believe that a place so gorgeous and so remote was located only a 1-hour train ride away from the busy city where they went to college. The couple's names were Kim and Chu. Kim was 21 years old, and he was an athlete and a very dedicated student. And Chu, she was 20 years old and also very studious, but maybe unlike Kim, she was a bit more reserved and shy. In fact, Kim was Chu's very first serious boyfriend, and she absolutely adored him. And in fact, this was going to be the couple's kind of big first trip that they would take together. It was a Friday, and Kim and Chu planned to spend the entire weekend exploring this place called Yelpo Beach. Yelpo Beach is located right against this quaint little fishing village, and it's famous for its beautiful silver-colored sand. In fact, the beach is so famous, lots of people come out here and just camp out on the beach because it's just so beautiful. There's also a very busy open-air seafood market right nearby, which is really cool because all the fishermen come in and literally offload their catch right onto the table, and they sell it to people coming by. And also up in the mountains, you could see these beautiful bright green crops, which were tea plantations that made the air in Yelpo Beach kind of floral and sweet smelling. But before Kim and Chu began exploring all the kind of main tourist attractions, they wanted to go check out the fishing pier, which was not really a touristy attraction. It was just a regular fishing pier. But, Kim and Chu had been on this hour-long train ride, and they wanted to stretch their legs, and the sun was starting to go down, and so they figured they could walk out on the pier, have a beautiful view of the water, then watch the sunset, and then after that, they could go kind of explore the main areas. And so Kim and Chu, still holding hands, began walking on the silver sandy beach in the direction of this fishing pier off in the distance. And as they were walking, Chu pulled out her camera and was taking all these pictures. But then at some point, Kim, who again is holding Chu's hand, he just abruptly stops and kind of squints his eyes and looks off in the distance towards the fishing pier. And Chu, she puts her camera down and asks Kim, what's going on? But Chu, without even saying anything to her, just raises his hand and points. And then seconds later, Kim and Chu were running down the beach. The next day, Chu was supposed to call her mother and check in about how the trip was going so far, but she never did. And so her mother eventually tried calling Chu later in the day, but it went straight to voicemail. And then also when Chu's mother called Kim, Kim was also not answering his phone. And so by the end of this day, when Kim and Chu's parents had not heard from their child, they did not wait for any more information. They knew this was so uncharacteristic of these two to go completely radio silent with no reason that the parents just went straight to the police and filed missing person reports. The police would launch an investigation very quickly, but they didn't have much to go on. All they knew was 2 adults were not answering their phone, but that was it. And so they started by trying to locate Kim and Chu's phones, but neither phone was giving off a signal, so they couldn't find them. And so next, the police went to Yelpo Beach and began talking to people who were there on the day that Kim and Chu were to ask them if they had noticed anything funny, if they had seen the couple, did you notice them fighting? Were they talking to anyone unusual? Anything. But nobody remembered anything out of the ordinary, and the few people who had seen Kim and Chu on the day they were at Yelpo Beach, they said they seemed like a very happy, normal couple that were not fighting at all and were just enjoying their time in Yelpo Beach. And so over the course of that weekend, the police tried everything they could to try to locate Kim and Chu and figure out what happened, but they really made no progress whatsoever, and Kim and Chu never checked in by the end of that weekend. But everything would change on that Monday, September 3rd. On that day, a fisherman spotted a body floating in the water near Yelpo Beach, and it was Chu's body. And then 2 days after that, on September 5th, Kim's body washed up at a dock at a nearby fishing village. Both Kim and Chu were totally unrecognizable after being submerged in water for as long as they had been. Autopsies would show that Kim and Chu also had lots of bone fractures, but it wasn't clear if they were beaten by someone or something and that's what caused the fractures, or if they were just a product of being in the water for so long and smashing into rocks and boats and that kind of thing. But the police thought, this looks like there could be foul play involved. Maybe they were murdered. And so the police went back and began scouring all the footage from all the cameras at Yelpo Beach to see if maybe they could find some clip that would show what happened to this couple. And eventually, one of the detectives who was looking through all this footage found something really interesting. He found a very short clip of the couple over at that fishing pier that they had been walking towards. However, they were not up on the fishing pier like you would expect. They were below the fishing pier on the sand, and they were kind of standing next to each other, holding each other close, and there was nobody else around them. It was like this totally weird thing. Now, as weird as this was, because it made no sense for them to be below the fishing pier, there didn't appear to be any hazards or other people or anything near them. It was like they just chose to be under there for some reason. But regardless, the police would actually use this video clip to close the case. The police would say that, based on this clip, it appears that this was the final moment of the couple, underneath this pier, and then something happened. Either an accident, they might have fallen in the water or something and they drowned, or maybe, this couple elected to take their lives together. And while Kim and Chu's families vehemently disagreed with the police assessment, there was nothing they could do. The case was now closed. Nobody was trying to figure out what happened to Kim and Chu. That is, until 4 weeks later, on September 26th, 2007, when two more bodies, two young women, washed up on shore right around the same area where Kim and Chu had. The two young women had a lot of similarities to Kim and Chu. They were in their early 20s, they were tourists at Yelpo Beach, and their autopsies discovered that they had several bone fractures. And so this was enough for the police to launch a much bigger investigation into what was going on at Yelpo Beach, which included reopening the Kim and Chu case. And so a detective was assigned to go back through all the evidence in the Kim and Chu case and kind of re-examine it. And so this detective did look through all these pictures, and he would find one picture that broke the case wide open. Back on the night that Kim and Chu were at Yelpo Beach and they began walking towards the fishing pier, Kim had abruptly stopped and raised his finger and pointed at something, and then seconds later, he and Chu were running in that direction. Well, what Kim had spotted was a fisherman who was standing below the fishing pier, and he was very obviously making his way over to his fishing boat to go back out on the water. And Kim just felt like it would be really cool to go ask that fisherman if they could join him and go out on the water with him on his fishing boat to get a view of Yelpo Beach that way. And Chu, when she heard this idea, thought it was a great idea, and the two of them ran to the pier to try to catch this fisherman before he took off. And so that was why there was footage of the couple standing underneath the fishing pier. They were actually talking to this fisherman who could not be seen in frame. The fisherman was a 70-year-old man named Woo Jun Gwen, and he made his living selling octopus. And at first, when Kim and Chu approached Woo and asked to go with him on his boat, he said, "No, I don't want you to come with me." But Kim and Chu seemed really desperate to go out with him, and finally he relented and said, "Okay, you can tag along." Woo was very thin and short, but he had been working on fishing boats since he was a child, and so despite his appearance of being this kind of small, frail guy, he was actually really physically strong. And despite Woo's kind of harmless-seeming exterior, inside, Woo was a very, very disturbed person. The reason Woo did not want to bring Kim and Chu with him out on this boat is he knew he would have an urge that he would not be able to control. But when they kept begging him over and over again to go with him, he finally just accepted that this was going to happen. He allowed them on his boat, he brought them out onto the water, and sure enough, he would act on those urges. Once Woo's boat was out on the water far away from the beach, he immediately pushed Kim overboard, and so Kim falls into the water, and then Woo grabbed this long metal grappling hook and began beating Kim in the water on his face, his arms, his hands, as Kim desperately tried to climb back in the boat. And eventually, Woo literally beat Kim to death. And at the same time, Chu is on this boat watching this happening. And so after her boyfriend has been beaten to death, Woo turns on Chu and does the same thing to her. He chucks her overboard and beats her until she dies from this grappling hook. And then afterward, Woo just got back behind the wheel, putted back to shore, and sold his octopus like nothing had happened. And Woo very likely would have gotten away with these first two murders, except 4 weeks later, it just so happened that two more tourists, those two young women, just happened to ask Woo the same question. Can we go out with you on your boat? And he would kill them the same way he killed Kim and Chu. Except one of those two young women, while they were out on the water in his boat before they were attacked, she sensed something was wrong, and she sent a text message saying she was in trouble on a boat. And when the police found these two women's bodies and found that text message, they immediately searched the registry that listed all the boats that had been out on the water near Yelpo Beach that day. And because it was a holiday, there was nobody out on the water except for one boat. And that boat was Woo's boat. And this is where that photo the detective found on Chu's camera roll, when finally somebody looked through the photos, that's where that photo comes into play. The last picture that Chu took is of Woo. Woo is right in front of her. He's piloting the boat out into the open ocean, and Chu just took a picture of him, not knowing what was actually happening, that this guy was driving her out to her death. Ultimately, Woo would be convicted of the murders, even though he didn't really offer up any clear explanation as to why he killed these people. He just kind of acted on these urges, so to speak, and he would be sentenced to death, and he would become the oldest death row inmate in South Korea. On the morning of June 25th, 2007, a 28-year-old man named Mike Barnett woke up to the sound of pounding rain on the roof of his home, which was located in Hull, which is a city in northern England. Mike groaned as he rolled out of bed. It had been raining like this for the past month, and he and the rest of the people in Hull were just totally over it. But another reason he groaned is he knew that he would have to go to his job at a tropical fish store, even though he was not scheduled to work that day. There was a street right behind the tropical fish store that always completely flooded out from all these debris getting clogged in the drain, and the owner of the tropical fish store, so Mike's boss, who was an elderly guy, he would always go out and try to clear the debris himself, and Mike just knew, he really needed help, and today he knew his boss would be out there, and so he just felt like it was his responsibility to go in and help him clear out the debris. So Mike got dressed, he had some breakfast, and then as quietly as he could, he slipped out the front door. Mike was careful not to make too much noise because he didn't want to wake his dad, who he lived with. Mike and his dad had always been very close, but after the death of Mike's mother, he and his father had become even closer, and so they actually really enjoyed living together. But Mike also knew that his dad was very protective of him and very likely would not like the idea of Mike going out in this horrible storm to go try to clear debris in a flooded out street. It just was too dangerous. And Mike just didn't want to deal with that right now, and so he was able to slip out without waking up his dad. Mike hopped in his car and he drove to the fish store, and as soon as he got there, he hopped out, he went around to the back side of the shop, and sure enough, the entire street out back was totally flooded. Clearly, debris had blocked the drainage system. Now, Mike's boss was not out there yet. Mike could see him inside the shop, kind of going about his morning, and so Mike, without even going inside, just began wading into the water to begin clearing debris. The drain that was clogged by all this debris was located just off to the side of the sidewalk. It was down in a culvert. And so Mike very carefully walked off that sidewalk into this very cold, muddy water, and he began moving in the direction of where he knew the drain was. And so as he's walking, the water is down to his ankles, maybe up to his knees at some point. But he gets closer and closer to where he knows this drainage is down in this culvert. And suddenly, Mike begins feeling this unbelievable suction at his feet that began pulling him basically straight down. Mike tried to move, but his feet were anchored to the ground. And then before long, he began getting pulled forward towards this drain, and then down he went. And as he went all the way down to his neck in the water, he felt this unbelievable pain in his thigh. Mike didn't know it, but his leg had been sucked through the drainage gate that was all blocked up. There were still some holes in it, and so his leg had gone through one of those holes, and it had pulled him all the way up to the top of his thigh and brutally snapped his leg in the process. And so Mike is in blinding pain from his leg being shattered and run through this grate, and he's literally up to his neck in this frigid water, and the wind's blowing and it's raining and the water's going in his mouth. And so Mike begins to panic and he's trying to pull himself out. He can't, and then he begins screaming for help. And at that moment, the owner of the fish store, who was still inside the store, looked out the window and he saw Mike flailing around. And instinctively, the owner could tell just from the panicked look on Mike's face that whatever was happening to him was an emergency. And so the owner just picked up the phone, called the police, and after telling them what was happening, the owner ran out to Mike. When the first police officers arrived on the scene, Mike was still in the water up to his neck, and the shop owner was right next to him. And the police officers, they assessed the situation in front of them, and they thought, okay, clearly this guy, Mike, is trapped in the water. This is serious, but we can pull him out. That's the obvious solution here. And so the two officers walked up to Mike, they waded through the water and got on either side of him, kind of pushing the shop owner out of the way. And then the two officers grabbed Mike's shoulders. These are strong police officers, and they began pulling on Mike. And as soon as they did, Mike let out this unbelievably loud scream of just pure agony. And in fact, his scream was so guttural that the two officers let go and were kind of startled by it. And very quickly, these officers realized this situation is far worse than it appears. Because not only is this guy totally stuck and he can't be moved, but, they're looking around and the rain is still coming down and it's clear the water is still slowly rising. And because Mike's body was situated over the grate, he himself was causing even more blockage, increasing how much the street was flooding. Meaning the officers knew they had to get Mike out as soon as possible or he would drown. But over the next several hours, more police officers, firefighters, EMTs, Good Samaritans, everybody showed up on the scene, and there were so many attempts to get Mike out of the water, ranging from trying to cut the grate, but the water was too muddy so nobody could see through it, and the water was so strong that nobody could set the bolt cutters on the actual grate. And then at one point, they even tied a winch around Mike and tried to pull him out with a Land Rover, but every intervention failed. The rushing water that was pinning Mike to this grate was so strong, and Mike's pain in his leg was so high, it made it nearly impossible to move him. And so finally, at the 4-hour mark that Mike has been trapped in this water, a decision was made amongst all the first responders to amputate. So the police called a doctor who was willing to perform the leg amputation. And then after doing it, Mike could sense something was up. Clearly it's not going well. And he began frantically asking the police and all the first responders, when are you going to get me out of here? When are you going to get me out of here? And they just kept telling him, soon, Mike, hold on. It's going to be okay. Meanwhile, the owner of the shop at this point had called Mike's dad to tell him what was going on. And so as all these people are waiting for this doctor to show up to cut Mike's leg off, Mike's father shows up and basically barrels through the crowd and starts screaming, "I'll get my son out of here." But as soon as he saw his son, he was totally taken aback. Mike was up to his chin in water. There was a diver behind him in the water with him, holding him up, barely keeping his head above the water. Mike's face was totally pale and his eyes were totally unfocused, and he had this weird blank expression like he wasn't even there. And then a second later, a whole wall of police came running up to Mike's dad to stop him from getting any closer, and they told Mike's father they were doing everything they could to try to get his son out, and for now, they told him he just needed to go home. And so even though Mike's dad did not want to abandon his son, he could tell with all these police standing there in front of him, there was no way he was going to be able to go up there with his son. And so he would turn around and head back home without even speaking to his son. And then when Mike's dad got home, he turned on the news, and the news was showing live coverage of his son trapped in that grate. And just a couple of minutes later, Mike's dad would watch his son die on the news. By the time that doctor arrived with that special saw to cut off Mike's leg, it was already too late. Mike had passed away from hypothermia. On a July day in 1976, a man named Ray suddenly felt this unbelievable pain in his chest. And so Ray, he grabbed his chest and he grimaced, and then the pain subsided. Now, Ray had never experienced any sort of pain like that before, but he knew he was getting older, and so things like heart attacks and heart disease were definitely on his mind. But he told himself that he was okay. A couple of days ago, he had gone to this big military veteran convention, and he had stayed up late and had lots of food and lots of drink, and so he was telling himself that, now he was paying for kind of letting loose. But after Ray lied down for a minute, thinking that might help him, he sat up suddenly because, again, the chest pain was back. And so quickly, Ray was rushed to the hospital, and when he got there, he began coughing up all this pink froth. And the doctors had no idea why. This was not a heart attack. This was not heart disease. This was something else. And not long after Ray was admitted to this hospital, all across the state, more men began being admitted to emergency rooms with the same symptoms as Ray, and nobody knew what it was. And so doctors all across the state began to panic that this was the start of a deadly epidemic. To hear the full story, check out The Philly Killer, which is episode number 15 of the MrBallen's Medical Mysteries podcast. And remember, you can actually binge episodes of MrBallen's Medical Mysteries early on Amazon Music because we release them in 8-episode batches, and so you get all 8 on Amazon Music. Or if you're listening on any other platform, you'll get all the episodes, but you'll get them in 1-episode increments each week. Again, go check out MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have literally hundreds of stories, a lot like these, that are available to listen to right now. Again, the podcast is just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you like today's video about places you can't go, well, you're in luck because we have a whole series of them. Click here. Today, we have 2 stories that are each about people who really craved attention or status. But instead of getting that, they got carnage. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to get new tires for the Like Button's car. But don't tell them you're replacing their regular tires with monster truck tires. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One afternoon in early September of 2004, 20-year-old Derek Keeper sat at a desk in the newspaper lab at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, furiously typing on one of the school's desktop computers. The lab that Derek was in was the hub of the university's school paper, the Daily Nebraskan. So there were some other students who were in the space that were talking or working at other computers. But Derek didn't notice any of them. He was completely locked in on what he was doing and writing as fast as he could. Because after he was done with the article that he was working on, he had a ton of other responsibilities that he needed to tackle. So Derek was involved in a lot of stuff at school. He was in a fraternity, he was a senator in the student government, he was a research assistant for the library, and he was pursuing 5 different majors. And Derek took all of his various commitments very, very seriously. But the column he was currently writing was really the one he had the most fun with. So Derek was from a small city in Nebraska, and even though he'd always been, personally a very loud and opinionated person, he'd never had a real platform for talking about all the ideas and points of views that he had. And so this column really gave him the opportunity to finally, actually present these big ideas to the students at school, and he hoped would likely provoke lively discussions around campus about his ideas. After all, Derek loved a good debate, and so he would intentionally choose to write about really complex issues that would get his readers fired up, like the ongoing war in Iraq and the future of the Republican Party and all the things that were wrong with local politics. The tone he went for when he wrote and talked about these kind of, contentious things was often very sarcastic, very blunt, and provocative. I mean, he really thrived on creating discourse and getting people to passionately disagree with him. And they usually definitely did, to the point where some even would get very mad with him. A lot of times, the paper's readers would write furious letters or even send hate mail about what Derek had written. But Derek was really not bothered by that at all. In some ways, that was his aim, to get people all riled up. And he was sure that the article he was writing right now was going to be even more divisive than really anything else he had written. For Derek, though, really for him, it was all about individual freedoms and encouraging people to say no to government overreach in their daily lives. I mean, that really was sort of his general stance on everything. That's really what inspired him to do any of this in the first place. In fact, this particular column that Derek was writing was about how he was advocating for abolishing a set of state and federal laws that were trying to control personal choice and the right to decide what was best for one's body, and he was against it. Now, to be clear, the stakes for this issue were life and death. I mean, literally. But Derek believed that the fundamental freedom of being an American was the right to make your own decisions, even if it meant risking your own personal safety. And so as Derek sort of furiously typed away, he was encouraging everyone, like senators and politicians, everybody, to have the same kind of intensity that he had about this issue, to be just fully bought in on this idea of, as Americans, we need individual freedom. And then finally, when he was all done typing, Derek sat back and proofread the whole thing, and when he got to the last line, he got chills. It said, quote, "I just wish we could keep the government out of our pocketbooks and out of our personal decisions." Derek loved that line, and so he nodded, satisfied with his work. He had nailed it. Then he emailed his draft to his editor with a big smile on his face. Derek's article went to print just a few days later, on September 17th. And like most of Derek's other articles, this one for sure got a lot of angry emails and letters from people who disagreed with what Derek had to say. But all the vitriol in these messages just proved to Derek that his article had clearly been a success. He had sparked outrage and got people talking about this issue. Derek even hoped that maybe some of the readers got angry enough to actually take action. That's what he wanted. He wanted his writing to genuinely inspire. The rest of Derek's semester was a total blur. He kept writing his weekly column on top of all of his other obligations and exams and everything else, and before he knew it, the semester was over, and he was headed to his mother's house in Texas for Christmas break. A few weeks later, on January 4th, 2005, at 3 a.m., Derek rode in the back seat of a Ford Explorer SUV on his way back to school after the break. He'd caught a ride from his mother's home in Texas with two of his fraternity brothers who were sitting up front. And Derek had spent the first part of this just awful 13-hour-long drive doing what he did best, using his sarcasm to make his friends laugh, and he was also engaging them in really animated conversations. And so, the first 6 to 8 hours had sort of flown by. But now, it's basically the middle of the night still, / very early morning, and everybody had just gone quiet because they were all exhausted from this truly awful, long drive. All any of them wanted to do at this point was just get back to campus and be done. And eventually, Derek and his friends were very close to campus. They were finally in Nebraska, and they were driving down Interstate 80, which was a snowy, cold highway not far from the school. And Derek was really excited to start the new semester. He'd had a nice, laid-back holiday where he'd caught up on sleep and spent a lot of time just kind of hanging out and seeing his younger siblings. But Derek just was not the kind of person who liked slowing down for very long. And so he was quite eager to get back to his busy life on campus. Especially, he really wanted to get back to his column. He had had a lot of downtime and was able to, brainstorm and come up with some good potential new topics for the column, but he really wasn't sure if any of those ideas were going to top, the very controversial article that he had published back in September. People were still talking about that one, and Derek was still thinking about it too. In fact, his own words and advice to his readers were still ringing in his ears and guiding his everyday decisions. But for now, Derek just leaned his head up against the cold glass window of the car and waited for this long trip to finally be over. But suddenly, he felt the SUV lurch, and before he knew what was happening, he heard a deafening bang and he heard his friends screaming. Just minutes later, a police officer was flying down Interstate 80 in his cruiser. Eventually, he spotted a group of ambulances parked on the side of the road, and he knew that's where he needed to go, so he pulled over to the side and stopped. And when he got out, he saw in a ditch just off the highway was an overturned SUV. The officer immediately jumped out of his cruiser and rushed towards the vehicle. And when he got there, he found the scene was just absolutely chaotic. There were a team of paramedics who were at the window of the SUV trying to assess the condition of the victims inside and to get them out. And when the officer kneeled down to look inside as well, he could clearly see two people inside the vehicle. Now, both of them seemed basically fine beyond, obviously being in a wreck. I mean, they were banged up and clearly dazed, but their injuries didn't look immediately life-threatening. So, sort of relieved, the officer backed away to let the paramedics do their thing. But very quickly, the officer noticed that more paramedics were actually running past the SUV to something on the ground a few feet beyond it. And so the officer followed them to go see what it was they were running to. And when he saw what was on the ground, the officer just kind of stopped and knew instinctively that there was nothing anybody could do. I mean, there was a body of a young man on the ground who clearly was a third passenger of this SUV, but their body was just mangled almost beyond recognition. It would turn out Derek had been right. His September 17th, highly contentious column in the Daily Nebraskan would be his most controversial and famous piece ever. And actually, people are still talking about it today. Because his column was about how, we, all us Americans, reserve the right to make our own choices about our bodies and personal safety. And Derek believed that there was a law that was actually directly infringing on that right, which was the law that was forcing people to wear a seatbelt. Derek despised this requirement. He thought seatbelts should be just a personal decision about safety. To him, it was not just about buckling up, it was about individual choice, about freedom. And on January 4th, that SUV that Derek was riding in going back to school, well, the driver hit some ice on the road and lost control. The driver and the other passenger in the front were wearing seatbelts. But Derek, in keeping with his beliefs, was not. And so when the SUV crashed and flipped over, Derek alone was killed. As one reporter pointed out, Derek lived by his beliefs, and he also died by them. Have you ever wished you could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in a live storytelling event? Well, that dream is becoming a reality this year because I'm coming back with another live tour. This year's tour is also going to include a whole bunch of new locations, including the West Coast of the United States, all across the United States, and also one international city. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. But if you want to see it, you got to act fast because tickets are available right now. If you want tickets, go to tour.ballenstudios.com or click the link in the description below. Again, that is tour.ballenstudios.com. Also, I'm going to be giving away an all-expenses-paid-for trip to come meet me at one of my live shows. That will include airfare, hotel, come hang out with me backstage. It's going to be a whole thing. And so if you want to potentially win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/MrBallen. That is fandiem.com/MrBallen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. Just before 9 p.m. on Friday, January 13th, 2012, 51-year-old Francesco Schettino and his girlfriend, Domenica, sat at a table in a crowded restaurant at a resort in Italy. And they'd been there for a while, having a leisurely meal. So their table was covered with empty dishes, a wine decanter, and plates with the remnants of their amazing food. Now, having an extended, indulgent dinner like this one was not technically allowed, since Francesco was actually working. But Francesco was not too worried about breaking what he considered to be a small rule, because he was not just some hired hand. I mean, he was in charge of this entire resort on Italy's Tuscan coast. And the resort was amazing. It was literally right out on the water and had thousands of guest rooms and 6 restaurants with over a dozen bars, a theater, multiple swimming pools, and there was even a casino. So it had really a huge capacity for guests. And right now, there were easily more than 3,000 people staying at this resort. And Francesco was, very proud to be the boss of this place, this unbelievable place. He actually had started working at this resort as a security guard, but he'd worked his way up to the very top. And now he'd been overseeing this property for about 6 years. And being a leader really worked well for his personality, because he loved being impressive and feeling important. He'd heard staff and former coworkers complain about how he was too over the top and a bit of a show-off, so he'd heard those things. But Francesco knew that really these people, they were just jealous. He was handsome, he had a great job, and he had 2 just beautiful, amazing women in his life when, some people didn't have any. And so now Francesco smiled at one of his girlfriends, Domenica, who sat across the table from him and enjoying the dessert they were sharing. Francesco was married, but recently, Domenica had become the most important woman in his life. She was a dancer, and to him, she was just perfect. They'd only met a few weeks ago, so they were still in the honeymoon phase, where they were both still very flirtatious and eager to impress one another. And so right now, Francesco knew he should leave and get back to his managing duties, but he was having so much fun with Domenica, so he lingered, eating his dessert as slowly as he could. But as he sat there, slow playing his dessert, he realized, their night together didn't actually have to end just because the dinner was over. There was something he could do right now that would give them maybe another hour or so together. And it would also completely blow Domenica away and prove to her just how amazing he really was. So, suddenly with a big smile on his face, he told Domenica to hurry up, finish eating, because they needed to get upstairs immediately. A few minutes later, Francesco and Domenica hurried into the resort's top floor operations center. And just like the entire rest of the place, this room, despite being an operations center, was still just massively impressive. In addition to all the very new age, high-speed monitors and security feeds and maps all over the room, there was this huge window that overlooked this balcony, this exterior balcony, that looked down on the ocean. It was like this beautiful view of the ocean, and it even overlooked a stretch of small seaside villages called Giglio. This room was also filled with all of Francesco's employees hustling around and, staring at screens and talking on headsets. But as soon as Francesco and Domenica walked in there, Francesco kind of went to the center of the room and kind of got everybody's attention and told them all to listen up. Then he went over the details of his big idea. The resort was going to put on a very specific and spectacular kind of show called a salute. And they were going to do it right now. So salutes were very popular in this area of Italy, and Francesco's resort actually did them all the time, so this was not totally unusual. They were basically kind of a performance, mostly for the locals, where the resort would flash all of its lights and play music, while guests of the resort would go to their balconies and wave and cheer to the residents and the other tourists in Giglio. But critically, salutes needed to be both quick and highly choreographed. That's really the only way they worked. And so in order for a salute to work, it really required the attention and active participation from a large number of people. This was a big to-do. And so given the fact that these were sort of a big endeavor, it meant that, something could go wrong if you're not really careful. And Francesco actually had a mentor who'd actively discouraged him to not do these salutes or try to do as few as you can because of the fact that things could go wrong. But Francesco's mentor was not physically here right now to tell Francesco to stop. And the people that were here were pretty excited about his idea. So Francesco began going over the plan with his staff. And, as he expected, with such a complicated undertaking, there were a lot of logistics to look over. However, when Francesco actually started going about these preparations, he realized he couldn't actually read anything because he didn't have his glasses on. He didn't think he looked handsome with them on, so he hadn't brought them out to dinner with Dominica, but now he really needed them. But thinking on his feet, Francesco simply asked a staff member to read him whatever information he really needed to know in order to do this salute. And so the staff member did as they were told, and at the end of it, Francesco felt like he had heard what he needed to hear and he thought everything was in order, and so he nodded and said, "Okay, we are all set to begin." And then he looked over at Dominica and smiled and sort of nodded like, "Okay, here we go." Then she knew whatever was coming next was going to be really, really special. When Francesco gave the actual order to begin the salute, everybody in the operations room jumped into action. And as soon as the actual salute began, Francesco squinted out the huge window that looked out over the ocean and Giglio down below, and Francesco was just so excited when he thought about how everyone who was out and about in town would look up and see his palace all lit up and full of life and energy. But as he peered at the lights of Giglio, he realized something wasn't quite right. Even without his glasses on, he could see that there was something outside in the darkness, just barely illuminated by the town's lights. It was a large shape right between the resort and Giglio. And to his horror, Francesco realized it was actually getting closer, fast. At the same time, but on the other side of the resort, an American man named Brian Aho was eating dinner with his wife and teenage daughter at the Milano restaurant, which was one of 6 restaurants in the resort. And they'd just been enjoying their meal when there was this deafening banging sound, and the entire room gave a huge jolt and everything inside just sort of went flying. Brian grabbed the table to brace himself as plates and glasses shot off the table and shattered everywhere. And then he heard screams and people hitting the ground all around him as diners were literally being thrown from their chairs. And then there was another series of crashes when some ceiling panels fell from above and smashed onto the ground. But then it was over. The shaking abruptly stopped, and Brian immediately jumped up to make sure that his wife and daughter were okay, and they did seem fine, just dazed like everybody else in the room. As Brian stood up, he could tell he was, mostly okay, also shaken up. But the overwhelming thought was just having no idea what had just happened. I mean, he's looking around and no one seemed to know. It had felt like some kind of earthquake or something. But then Brian thought, if this had been an earthquake, he really had to get his family out of this restaurant immediately in case of aftershocks. But it seemed like all the other diners clearly had the same idea, because before Brian could actually move, there was a surge of activity around him as dozens of people just began rushing towards the exit of the restaurant. And Brian didn't want him or his family to get caught in the middle of this huge crowd. Huge amounts of people running in the exact same direction, a panicked group of people, could easily create a stampede. And he was worried that he and his family could get pulled to the ground and trampled in the chaos. So he looked around and he saw on the other side of the restaurant there was a smaller door that nobody else was going to. So he and his family began making their way over to it. But before they could actually get through this door, the overhead lights began to flicker and then went out. And then with the darkness, suddenly came the blast of emergency alarms echoing through the resort. And then he could hear more screams, not just inside of this restaurant, but sort of all over the place. It was like the resort had devolved into madness. Brian had never been more scared in his whole life. I mean, his pulse was racing faster than he thought was even possible, and he almost felt paralyzed, like this was just too much to even process. He also, like basically everybody else, had no clue what was going on here. But I mean, navigating his family through an emergency was already going to be horrifying and terrifying and dangerous, but now he would also have to do it in the dark. For a moment, Brian and his family just stood there, kind of frozen in the dark. And then Brian was about to tell his family to just go through the door, we'll figure it out in the dark. But then luckily, the emergency lights came on, giving the room sort of a dim, eerie glow. But it was enough to sort of guide their way. And so at that point, Brian didn't wait. He grabbed his wife and his daughter, pushed through the side door, and headed out into the hallway. It would take nearly 10 minutes for Brian and his family to navigate the maze of hallways they had just walked into until finally they stepped outside and were in the open air. But when they finally got out there, Brian realized they actually had a really big problem, because the exit they had just taken had taken them not to safety. It had led them to this expansive outdoor terrace with a railing on the 4th floor of the resort, which meant they still needed to get down multiple levels in order to, evacuate safely. But just the fact they were on the 4th floor was not the big issue. The big issue was the terrace was clearly packed with other people from the resort who were also trying to evacuate. There was all these people basically blocking their way. So basically, everybody who has no idea what's going on is just like pushing and shoving each other, and there were no authority figures or any staff around to actually direct what now was basically an evacuation. And Brian could tell that the crowd was clearly starting to panic, and really he was too. Everybody was just like, what's happening here? And so Brian was about to suggest to his family that they try to find another way out when they heard the crackling of the resort's public speaker system, and a voice came on that finally delivered some information about what was happening. It said that there had been an electrical blackout, but everything was fine, and technicians were hard at work trying to fix the problem. So in the meantime, all the guests should stay calm and just go to their rooms for safety. And at this point, it was very obvious that the mood all around Brian and his family completely changed. People stopped pushing and arguing and panicking, and Brian himself felt that knot of dread in his stomach sort of loosen a bit. I mean, an electrical blackout didn't seem like a life or death situation, so he, and clearly everybody else, felt a whole lot less scared. Pretty much right away, many of the guests began heading back inside, making their way to their rooms. And Brian actually spotted a few staff members who were in the crowd, encouraging people to do just that, go back to your rooms. And so for a few moments, Brian and his family and the others just kind of stayed put and just kind of let things play out, kind of watching things settle back into normal. But then it was like with no warning, there was this other huge banging sound, and the floor once again buckled under Brian's feet. And this triggered a whole new wave of just absolute chaos out on this terrace. All at once, everybody started shouting and pushing each other in pure panic. And at the same time, there were all these new announcements coming out frantically over the loudspeaker, but it wasn't doing anything. It was like the crowd had decided something bad is happening and no one can tell me otherwise. I have to leave. Everybody is just trying to evacuate all at once. And so pretty much right at this point, you had a group of people who were out on the terrace who decided to charge into the resort to try to find another way to evacuate. And also you had the group of people who had already gone back inside to go back to their rooms, who had changed their mind, who charged right back out, back onto the terrace. And so for a moment, it was like these two pools of people kind of smashing into each other, and Brian and his family were kind of off to the side because they had just barely stepped out onto the terrace when all of this stuff was happening. But then Brian watched in complete shock as he saw some of the people, after they pushed through all the way to the edge of the terrace to the railing, they began climbing over the railing to climb down from the 4th floor. Seeing this was horrifying for Brian, but then he felt yet another shudder under his feet and a loud industrial groaning sound from the resort right behind him, and he knew if he didn't do what these people were doing, he and his family might not be able to evacuate. Clearly, there was a real problem. They didn't know what it was, but they had to go. So he grabbed his wife and his daughter's hands, he shoved his way through the crowd to the railing, over the railing they went, and down they began to climb. Meanwhile, back up in the top-level operations center, Francesco was staring out the room's huge window, just completely frozen in shock. His resort was in complete pandemonium. Below, guests were running, others were fighting and shoving, and some were literally leaping to their potential deaths from the upper-level balconies and terraces. And so as Francesco watched all of this carnage, he tried to wrap his head around how the night had gone so horrifically wrong. The worst part of all of it was there was absolutely no way to fix it. He'd been trying to show Dominica and everybody else how amazing and impressive and in control he was, but he'd completely lost control of this whole situation. And he'd also lost his girlfriend because Dominica had quickly fled the resort. And then there was a loud crashing sound somewhere in the distance, and his heart pounded, and he realized it was time for him to start running too. Minutes later, Francesco and some of his staff sprinted through the halls of the resort. And as they ran, thunderous noises and bangs came from every direction, and debris from the ceiling and walls crashed to the ground all around them as they were shaken loose. And all the while, over the noise, Francesco could hear the continuous shrieks of panic from people who were still clearly trapped inside the resort and just couldn't get out. But he and the others he was with finally did make it to the exit. And this exit was not overrun with panicking people. So Francesco was lucky enough to be able to pretty quickly make it to the bottom level and then keep on going. And he did not look back, not until he was far away and definitely to safety. But when he did finally stop running, and he did turn around and looked back at his resort, his stomach pitched so hard he nearly vomited. Because finally, he could see right in front of him the full, horrible extent of what he had done. It would turn out what Francesco was looking at was the culmination of a record number of terrible choices he had made that night. 1. Francesco would later deny this, but he was seen drinking alcohol at dinner while he was supposed to be working. 2. He was not wearing his glasses, which meant he was his most handsome self, but also that he couldn't see very well. And 3. He was distracted by his new girlfriend, who he had brought to an area where only key personnel were allowed because he was desperate to impress her. Now, in most workplaces, this would all just be considered unprofessional and maybe might get you fired. But in Francesco's workplace, it was much worse than that. What he had done was incredibly dangerous because the resort that Francesco managed was not a regular hotel. It was a gigantic cruise ship called the Costa Concordia. Francesco was its captain, and when he issued the order for the boat to do a salute, he was not just ordering a complicated but entertaining show. A cruise ship salute also involves steering the massive boat much closer to shore than usual to appropriately show off to the locals on land. But because Francesco literally couldn't see very well, was obviously distracted and possibly drunk, he didn't notice that when they did this salute, they were going way too fast and way too close to shore. That shape he saw rushing towards them in the darkness was an enormous cluster of rocks. By the time he saw it, it was too late. The Concordia had smashed into the rocks, tearing a 230-foot wide hole in the hull, which immediately flooded the ship. And then making matters even worse, Francesco delayed rescue efforts for more than an hour by trying to convince people that what had happened was just an electrical outage. And then when he finally did issue an evacuation order, he broke a sacred rule for ship captains. He fled the boat before the remainder of his crew and the passengers. Like he was the first one off. He did not go down with his ship. That American passenger, Brian Aho, and his family would survive, because after they decided to go over the railing, they, perilously climbed down 4 levels all the way to a lifeboat, and so they survived. But unfortunately, 32 other people who were on board the boat ultimately died, all because of Francesco's desire to show off. Francesco himself was ultimately arrested for manslaughter and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. He was subsequently named Italy's most hated man. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. On the evening of August 10th, 2005, a man in New York City answered the phone at the office where he worked. A woman's voice came across the line, and she asked to speak with one of the man's employees. And the man thought for a second, and then he ultimately replied that actually, that employee had not shown up for their shift that afternoon, and they didn't know why, but they weren't here. And when he said this, he heard a distinct shift in this woman's tone, and she told him in a very trembling voice that she needed to hang up now and call 911. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you go hiking with the like button, make sure to secretly replace all the contents from their backpack with garbage. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early afternoon of Wednesday, August 10th, 2005, 18-year-old Eliza Parcy sat in her bed in her home in Staten Island, New York, flipping through a fashion magazine. The house was quiet because Eliza's mother, Seema, was at work, so Eliza had the whole house to herself, at least for a little while, until she herself went to work. Eliza had graduated high school just a few months ago, and now she was working as a clerk at a moving company to try to save up some money for college, and also to eventually move into Manhattan to pursue her dream of working in the fashion industry. However, Eliza did feel a bit guilty about moving away, because it would mean leaving her mom all alone in this big house. And there wasn't really any other family nearby because both of her parents were from Israel. Seema had divorced Eliza's father about 1.5 years ago, and her father had left New York and moved back to Israel. Eliza also had 2 half-brothers who were Seema's sons from her first marriage, and one of them was back in Israel as well, and the other, Eliza's 27-year-old half-brother Raviv, lived just a short drive away in another part of the city. But Eliza and Seema rarely saw him because he was married with a new baby and lived with his in-laws, and so he basically had a whole new family. And also, Raviv had been put in charge of the Parcy family's kosher cookie business, which was really struggling. So he was really busy and always stressed about the company, and he really just didn't make it out to Staten Island very often. Eliza flipped through the last few pages of her magazine and then noticed that it was time to get ready for her 2 p.m. shift at work. But first, she wanted to check and see if she had any new messages on her internet dating profiles. So she put her magazine down, went over to her desk, and logged into her computer. So in 2005, internet dating was just starting to take off, and Eliza had made profiles on a few different dating and meetup websites just to see what would happen. And before long, she had found herself messaging and meeting up with men from all around New York City. But she never told her mother about this because she knew that her mother would not approve of Eliza dating men who were not from their same Orthodox Jewish faith. And Eliza knew this for a fact because it's exactly what had happened with her previous boyfriend at the public high school that she went to. Eliza had friends from all different backgrounds, and she had started seriously dating a Muslim boy named Hassan, but her family had really disapproved of their relationship entirely because of his faith. And so eventually, Eliza just couldn't take the family pressure anymore, and she'd broken up with him. And so now, Eliza was much more secretive about her personal life. She would come up with these phony reasons why she was going to other neighborhoods, but really it was just so she could go on dates or hook up with guys for fun without her mom knowing. And also, she had even begun secretly bringing some of them to her house in Staten Island. But she was always very careful to sneak them in through the back door when her mom was at work, so she wouldn't get caught. Now, Eliza logged into her account, and she saw there were a few messages from some guys, and so she responded to them, and then after that, she headed into the bathroom to take a shower before work. And a few minutes later, when Eliza finished her shower and turned off the water, she heard a noise coming from outside the bathroom. Now, she couldn't tell what it was. Earlier that afternoon, she'd heard a landscaping crew working at the house next door with some really loud leaf blowers, but this noise was different. It was like a weird banging sound. So, curious, Eliza got out of the shower, wrapped a towel tightly around herself, and opened the bathroom door to go see what was going on. That night, around 7:30 p.m., Eliza's mother, Seema, arrived back at the house that she shared with Eliza. She turned her key in the front lock and tried to push the door open, but it would only open a couple of inches because it felt like there was something on the other side that was blocking it from opening any further. Now, Seema had no idea what this could be, and so she just began shoving against the door, and eventually she pushed it open wide enough that she could slip inside. And when she did, the first thing she noticed was that the thing that had been blocking the door was this heavy mirror. But before Seema's mind could really process how this mirror wound up here, she turned on the lights, and saw that her living room was absolutely destroyed. Furniture was overturned, cabinets were flung open, and papers were just strewn everywhere. Seema immediately felt her heart start pounding because she realized that clearly somebody had broken in and robbed the place. But then her second thought was, where is Eliza? Where's my daughter? Because Seema knew that Eliza had been home at least part of the day, and what if this had happened when Eliza was here all alone? And so Seema began calling out for her daughter, but there was no answer. And so she followed the chaos upstairs and noticed that the door to Eliza's room was closed. So she went over to the door and put her hand on the knob and tried to open it up, but it was locked. And Seema knew that this was just not normal. Eliza never locked this door. And so now, Seema's thinking something has happened here. Something bad has happened here. And so sort of in a panic, Seema just began banging on the door, screaming her daughter's name, hoping she would answer, but it was silent. And so after a couple of seconds, Seema pulled out her phone and called the moving company where her daughter worked. And her stomach dropped when Eliza's boss told her that her daughter had not shown up to work that day. And so with trembling hands, Seema got off that call and dialed 911. About an hour later, Detective Michael Kenny of the New York City Police Department drove slowly down a neighborhood street in Staten Island. Ahead, he could see his destination, a 3-story house with yellow crime scene tape across the front yard. But it was hard to get close because the street was now swarming with neighbors and just random people who had come out to see what was going on. So Kenny parked a few houses down and then headed for the house on foot. And when he got there, he was met by 2 patrol officers. And they told Kenny that they had responded to a call about a robbery and then had to break down a door of a locked bedroom where they ultimately found the dead body of 18-year-old Eliza Parcy, who lived in the house with her mother, Seema. The officers explained that when they had checked the rest of the scene, they had noticed that the entire house was basically torn apart, but they hadn't found any signs of forced entry. The officers then directed Kenny's attention over to Seema, who was standing nearby with a small group of people, presumably family or neighbors. Kenny knew he would have to talk to her, but first, he needed to get a better sense of just what was going on inside of this house. So Kenny made his way in the front door and surveyed the living room, where some crime scene techs had already begun processing the scene. The room had definitely been torn apart, but as Kenny looked closer, he could see that a lot of valuable items were sitting untouched and out in the open, like the TV and the stereo, which was unusual for a burglary. Next, Kenny walked up the stairs and into Eliza's room, where more techs were collecting evidence, and the first thing he noticed was that this room also looked ransacked. There were clothes and pillows thrown everywhere, and the mattress had been pulled off the bed frame and was leaning up against the wall. And on the floor in the middle of the room was Eliza's body. She was lying on the ground, and she was naked, and there was a towel sort of bunched up underneath her. Kenny asked one of the techs if this is exactly how the body had been found, and the tech said no. When they first got to the scene, Eliza had actually been underneath the mattress and also had a pillow over her face, but they had to move both of those things out of the way in order to actually examine her body, which was why, the mattress was now up against the wall. Kenny knelt down over Eliza's body, but he couldn't see any visible cause of death, like a bullet or knife wounds or bruising, which could mean that maybe she was suffocated. Maybe the pillow that was on her face that they had removed was what was used to kill her. Kenny turned and asked the tech if they had found any evidence of physical injury, and the tech pointed to just a few tiny drops of blood that were on the towel underneath Eliza. Now, they were very small and they could have been old, like maybe somebody had cut themselves shaving, but all these details, a naked young woman, the mattress, the pillow, the blood, it made Kenny concerned that Eliza might have been a victim of sexual assault before she was killed. So Kenny told the tech to make sure that the blood from the towel, as well as any other bodily fluids they could find, were collected as evidence, because they might belong to Eliza's killer. A few minutes later, Kenny emerged from the house and began walking over to speak with Seema. And Seema, she was crying onto the shoulder of a young man, and the minute this young man saw Kenny, he stepped forward and started demanding to know why the police were keeping them away from Eliza's body, and also why the cops weren't out there arresting his sister's killer. So Kenny just took a deep breath, because this man was obviously Eliza's brother, and it was understandable why he was so upset. Kenny knew that a lot of times grief turned into anger in these situations. So Kenny calmly explained that in order to find Eliza's killer, he first needed information, starting with where he and Seema had been that day. And this got both Raviv and Seema to calm down right away, because they seemed to realize that Kenny might actually be suspicious of them. So the man lowered his voice, and he introduced himself as Raviv, and then he and Seema began answering Kenny's questions. Seema said she'd been at work all day and that there were plenty of coworkers who could say as much, and Raviv explained that he too had been working all day, delivering baked goods all around Long Island. Kenny made notes so he could double-check all their information later. And then he asked if either of them knew anybody who might have had a reason to want to harm Eliza, and Kenny saw them share a very knowing glance. Then Raviv turned to Kenny and said he should look into Eliza's ex-boyfriend, Hassan, who none of them liked or trusted. And as Kenny started jotting these details down, Seema chimed in and added that her daughter had told her about something really bizarre that Hassan had done recently. Early one morning a few weeks ago, Eliza had woken up to find Hassan sitting at the end of her bed, just staring at her, like he'd been watching her sleep. And the whole thing had absolutely terrified Eliza because she had no idea how he'd even gotten into the house. She certainly hadn't invited him over, and their house was always locked overnight. And then before Detective Kenny could even ask a follow-up question, Raviv, the brother, just suddenly started yelling, get out, we don't want you here," at somebody across the yard. And so Kenny turned to see who Raviv was yelling at, and he saw this teenage boy standing there, looking completely shocked and scared. And at this point, Raviv went from yelling at Hassan to yelling at Kenny to arrest Hassan, because that was the man who killed Eliza. Late on the night of August 10th, 2005, so just a few hours after the body of 18-year-old Eliza Parcy was found dead in her home in Staten Island, NYPD detective Michael Kenny sat inside of an interrogation room at his precinct. Across from him was Eliza's ex-boyfriend, Hassan, who had been detained after he showed up at the crime scene. So far, Hassan had been very cooperative and had shared a very detailed timeline of his whereabouts that day. However, he did not have a solid alibi for that afternoon and the early evening, which was likely when Eliza was killed. Kenny had taken a DNA sample from Hassan, and he also had gotten samples from Eliza's mother and brother at the scene to compare against the blood that had been found on that towel and any other DNA that was found on Eliza's body. But in 2005, DNA and blood evidence took weeks to process. So Kenny was really hoping to just get Hassan to confess right now. So once all his basic questions were out of the way, Kenny decided to test Hassan's truthfulness. And he asked Hassan if he had ever snuck into Eliza's house. But Hassan, he didn't deny it. He immediately came clean and admitted to everything. He said that yes, he had previously snuck into her house, and he did sit on Eliza's bed, and he had waited there until she woke up. That was all true. But Hassan insisted that he had not been trying to scare Eliza. He just desperately wanted to talk to her so they could hopefully get back together again. And Hassan had said that when he did that, Eliza hadn't been scared. She was just kind of annoyed, and she had told him that they were broken up for real. And after that, he said he had left without incident. Kenny noticed that in Hassan's version of the story, the way that Eliza reacted to Hassan sitting on her bed, just being kind of annoyed and exasperated about it, was very different than the way Eliza's mother, Seema, had described the same event. She had said that her daughter had basically been scared for her life. So he asked Hassan, why does Eliza's family dislike you so much? Why were they so quick to say you killed Eliza? And Hassan just kind of hung his head and said he didn't think it was about him personally. It was about religion. Hassan was Muslim, and the Parcys were Orthodox Jewish. As Kenny took this in, he wasn't sure which version of the story to believe. Were Hassan and Eliza star-crossed lovers kept apart by her family? Or was Hassan an obsessive ex-boyfriend who couldn't take no for an answer? But regardless, Kenny could not ignore the fact that Hassan had a strong motive and a history of sneaking into Eliza's house uninvited. But Kenny still didn't have a confession from Hassan, nor did he have really any hard evidence at all that would allow him to even hold Hassan. So ultimately, after the interview was over, he told Hassan he was free to go. The next day, Thursday, August 11th, Detective Kenny walked up to a Jewish Orthodox synagogue in Brooklyn, where Eliza's funeral was about to take place. The reason it was happening so quickly was because of the Jewish Orthodox custom that a body must be buried within 24 hours of death. And because of that timeline, it meant that Eliza's autopsy had already been completed. And Kenny had just received the report from the medical examiner, which confirmed that Eliza had died from asphyxiation, likely from being smothered by that pillow. The medical examiner had also found DNA evidence that could be tested against those samples Kenny had collected from the suspects. There were some skin cells under Eliza's fingernails, as well as semen that showed Eliza had sex before she died, probably within 24 hours. And so this evidence made Kenny think that Eliza had been sexually assaulted and had fought back against the person assaulting her, which would explain the skin under her nails. But when Kenny called the medical examiner to voice this theory that he now thought was pretty likely, the medical examiner had actually disagreed, because they didn't find any bruising or bleeding or anything else that indicated sexual violence. And so the autopsy actually concluded that the sex Eliza had before she was killed must have been consensual. But regardless, in Kenny's opinion, the facts of the case so far pointed towards a romantic partner being the killer, which obviously cleared Raviv and Seema and any other family members. And it also did not seem to be some random burglar or home intruder, because Seema had confirmed that nothing in the house was missing. Now, a few of the neighbors had mentioned that there had been some landscapers who had been working at the house next door at the time of her death, and Kenny had managed to track down the crew and question them. But they had all insisted that they had never left the neighbor's yard and that they hadn't seen or heard anything. But just to be sure, Kenny had taken their DNA samples just in case. Now, as Kenny made his way through the crowded sidewalk in front of the synagogue, he could see two distinct groups of people in attendance. There were members of the Orthodox community wearing their long skirts and prayer shawls, and also young people dressed in more modern clothes, who he assumed were Eliza's friends from school. Kenny walked up the front steps and entered the synagogue, and he noticed that the inside of the building was split in half by a wooden partition, almost like a wall, with men on one side and women on the other. So Kenny joined the men's side and stood in the back corner where he could just observe. Kenny noticed Eliza's brother, Raviv, standing near the front, near the casket, and he watched as other men walked up to pay him their respects. The atmosphere was solemn, understandably, and Kenny didn't pick up on any tension or animosity. It just sort of felt like a community coming together to kind of make sense of this tragedy. But then Kenny felt the energy in the room suddenly change, like a switch had flicked, and he could hear people start to whisper to each other very urgently, and everybody's heads turned to look back towards the entrance. Kenny turned his head and looked as well, and he saw this one person who was trying to push through the crowd and make their way up the aisle to the front, where Eliza's casket was. And Kenny realized this person was Hassan. For some reason, he'd shown up again, despite the fact that Eliza's family clearly didn't want him around. And Kenny actually watched as Raviv, who, had seen Hassan, Raviv went straight to Hassan and literally stopped him and shoved him backwards and shouted at him to get out, because they all knew he killed Eliza. Kenny, sensing a physical fight was going to happen here, began pushing his way through the crowd to try to stop them and separate them. But fortunately, before he reached them, other men separated Hassan and Raviv, and then Hassan was escorted out of the building. About 2 weeks later, on August 24, 2005, Detective Kenny was in the office of the NYPD Computer Crime Unit, where the department's IT specialists had begun digging into Eliza's online life. After her funeral, Kenny had spoken to Eliza's school friends, who had told him that Eliza had been trying to move on from her relationship with Hassan, and that she had actually opened accounts on a whole bunch of dating sites that she used to meet guys or sometimes just hook up. And when Kenny had pressed them for more information, the friends had told him that none of those online men were from her tight-knit Orthodox community, which was part of the appeal to Eliza. But it obviously was not something she wanted to share with her mother, so she'd kept it all a big secret from everybody except from her closest friends. Kenny had been able to actually get Eliza's computer with her mother's permission and had brought some IT specialists on board who were able to dig into Eliza's email and browser history. Now, Kenny watched as the IT specialists directed his attention to one of Eliza's dating site message threads. In this thread, Eliza and a man named Jonathan were making plans for when and where they were going to meet up to have sex. They'd gone back and forth on a few different options until finally, Eliza just said that he should just come over to her house when her mother was at work, and that she would leave the back door unlocked so he could sneak in without the neighbors seeing. Kenny saw that this particular hookup was planned for Tuesday, August 9th, 2005, just one day before Eliza was killed. Now, naturally, this made Kenny and the rest of the investigators raise an eyebrow, because this plan of Eliza and Jonathan's, of having him enter secretly through the back door while Seema was at work, matched up exactly with what they had found at the crime scene. In late August of 2005, more than 2 weeks after the murder of Eliza Parcy, NYPD detective Michael Kenny was sitting at a kitchen table in an apartment in Brooklyn, New York, across from Jonathan Harris, the internet dating match who Eliza had secretly invited to her home the day before she was killed. When Kenny informed the young man that he was here investigating the murder of Eliza Parcy, he noticed that Jonathan didn't seem surprised. But Eliza's murder had been all over local news, and a lot of stories were really exploiting her romantic past and her sex life, so he had probably already heard about what had happened. Kenny asked Jonathan if he had known Eliza, and Jonathan said yes. Then he detailed basically everything that had been planned in that chat message. He said that he had gone to her house, he had snuck in through the back door that was unlocked, and they had had consensual sex. At least Jonathan swore it had been consensual. Jonathan insisted that after that, he had not seen Eliza again, and had never even gone back to Staten Island after that. He then gave Kenny a detailed timeline of where he had been on the day Eliza was killed, and overall, he was a lot more cooperative than Kenny had expected. He even provided a DNA sample without any objection. And so as Kenny left Jonathan's apartment, he was starting to feel a bit worried that this potential big break in the case might actually turn out to be a dead end. Weeks later, on September 13th, 2005, Detective Kenny sat at his desk, reviewing all the information he had gathered about Eliza Parcy's murder. He had checked Jonathan's phone records, also his transit card, and his toll pass, but there was nothing that put him on Staten Island the day of Eliza's murder. And the computer crimes investigators had not turned up any other promising suspects from Eliza's online dating profiles. Detective Kenny had also continued digging into Hassan, but he didn't have enough evidence to either arrest him or clear him. And this was frustrating because Eliza's murder had stayed in the news, and there was a lot of pressure to find the killer, especially from the Orthodox Jewish community, which was significant in New York. It was starting to look like the case had gone cold. But just then, Kenny's phone rang, and when he picked it up, it was the medical examiner who was calling with an update. The results of the DNA analysis were finally in, and the semen sample did not match those skin cells that had been found under Eliza's fingernails. So this meant there was DNA from 2 different people at the crime scene. And when the medical examiner said who each of these samples belonged to, suddenly Detective Kenny knew who killed Eliza. Based on the entire investigation, DNA evidence, and the killer's eventual confession, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Eliza Parcy on the afternoon of August 10th, 2005. Shortly before 2 p.m., the killer approached the back door of the Parcy home where they knew they wouldn't be seen by neighbors. And once they were there, they slowly opened up the door. Once they were inside, they walked all the way through the house right to the front door just to check to make sure it was locked, which it was. And so after that, they went and got a heavy mirror and they moved it and put it in front of the door to block it. The killer knew that both women who lived in this house, Seema and her daughter Eliza, worked during the day. And so the killer didn't expect them to come home. But just in case, they didn't want to take any chances, hence barricading the door. Once they were satisfied with the barricade, the killer got to work, opening drawers and cabinets, looking in every place they could, because they needed something very specific inside of this home that was very valuable. But they couldn't find it anywhere on the bottom floor, which made the killer think it must be in one of the bedrooms upstairs. So the killer climbed the stairs and went into the master bedroom, where they looked through the dresser and in the closet, but they still couldn't find what they were looking for. So the killer left the master bedroom and decided to search the other bedroom next. But when they opened the door to that bedroom, they were shocked to see a young woman coming out of the attached bathroom wrapped in a towel. And from this young woman's reaction on her face, the killer could tell that she knew what they, the killer, were up to. And this enraged the killer because they were sure this woman was going to tell someone what she saw, and it would ruin the killer's plan. After a moment of just shocked silence between the two of them, the young woman opened her mouth like she was about to scream for help. And so the killer instinctively just tackled her to the ground and then grabbed a nearby pillow and pressed it down hard over her face. She scratched and she clawed, trying everything to break free. But the more she fought, the angrier and more emboldened the killer became, and the harder they pressed down, until eventually her body went limp. After that, the killer stood up and they looked down and they saw what they had done, and it caused them to start to panic, because they never meant to kill her, just to scare her and shut her up, but they had obviously gone too far. So, not knowing what to do, the killer just grabbed the pillow and put it over her face, and then also dragged the mattress and put it on top of her body, just so they wouldn't have to look at her. Then, instead of continuing their search for this thing that they wanted inside of this home, they just went downstairs and left out the back door. And they didn't return to the house for hours, not until they received a call from their mother, because the killer was Eliza's half-brother, Raviv. The DNA from the semen that was found at the crime scene belonged to Jonathan, the man that Eliza had consensually had sex with 24 hours before her death. The DNA that was found under Eliza's fingernails belonged to Raviv. It would turn out Eliza's death did not have anything to do with who she was sleeping with. Raviv was angry at their mother because the family business that she had passed along to him didn't make as much money as he had thought it would. And so as a result, Raviv was stuck working all these long hours and also raising his family in his in-laws' basement, which he found totally humiliating. And he knew that Seema had recently come into some money through the sale of a property in connection with her divorce. And Raviv felt like that money was rightfully his, because he had a wife and a child to provide for. But Seema wouldn't give it to him. So instead of driving his typical delivery route on Long Island that day, Raviv went to his mother's house to literally look for the money so he could steal it. But Eliza's work schedule had recently changed, and so he didn't realize Eliza's shift actually started later in the day. And so what was supposed to be a simple robbery turned deadly. Raviv ultimately pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Hey everyone, just a reminder, I'm going on tour this year, which means if you go, you can experience never-before-heard stories from me live and in person. We did this in 2024 and people loved it. So get your tickets today at tour.ballenstudios.com right now before they sell out. That's tour.ballenstudios.com. I can't wait to see you all at the shows. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. If you Google the craziest war story of all time, the story I'm going to tell today always pops up as the #1. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please remove all of the trash bags from inside all of the like button's trash cans and then proceed to throw away various perishable saucy food items. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Born in South Texas in 1935, Roy Benavidez was orphaned as a young child and sent to live with his uncle. As a young teen, he had to drop out of school to work in the beet and cotton fields just to help support his family. When he turned 18, he decided he wanted to get away from his hometown and do something bigger with his life, and so he enlisted in the Army, and shortly after that, he went to airborne school and then was assigned to the very famous 82nd Airborne Division. In October of 1964, Roy was a part of the first 125,000 Americans sent to Vietnam. While While on a classified operation that required Roy to dress up as an enemy combatant, he stepped on a landmine in the middle of the jungle and nobody else was with him. So he's totally stranded. But fortunately, a squad of US Marines came upon him, but from what he was wearing, they assumed he was an enemy soldier. And so they almost walked past him, but someone thought to just flip him over and see who he was. And they discovered he was American and he had American dog tags on. And so he was evacuated from Vietnam and sent to an American hospital. And there, a doctor would tell him that he had a serious spinal injury and that it was unlikely he would ever walk again. And Roy's first reaction was, please don't discharge me from the Army. Because for Roy, the Army was his life. It was all he had. He was incredibly proud of it. And he desperately wanted to go back to Vietnam. And so he pleaded with the doctors and the nurses, please let me have some time to try to regain my strength in my legs so that I don't get medically discharged. And so they said, look, you're going to get medically retired if you aren't walking within the year. And so every night when his doctors and nurses would leave, he would fall out of his bed and then drag himself across the ground to the wall. And then he'd pull himself up and try to put weight on his legs and attempt to build strength back up and retrain himself how to walk. And after 6 months of doing this every night, he did literally reteach himself how to walk. He built up strength in his legs, and his doctors and nurses, they're watching this transformation during the day, but they're not seeing him at night. And they're telling him, this is a miracle. We've never seen this before. We've never seen someone recover so quickly. And Roy just stayed quiet because he wanted to make sure he was allowed to keep doing that every night. And so finally, after those 6 months, his doctors and nurses agreed that, yep, he's good. He can stay in the Army. But the Army said they wanted him to take a desk job because he had already been so badly wounded in combat. And Roy didn't want that. He pleaded with them to let him go back to the 82nd, but they said, no, we're not going to risk you getting hurt again. And so he was sent to North Carolina for his desk job. And as soon as he got there, he began training like a maniac every minute of every day, trying to get in the best shape of his life, because his plan in his head was once he got there, he would try out for Special Forces. He would try to become an Army Green Beret, which is the premier combat unit in the Army. It's one of the hardest ones to get into, and their training program is in North Carolina. And so after a few months, he was in amazing shape, and he asked his superiors, can I go try out to be a Green Beret? And they're like, I can't believe you're even walking, but you know what? You've come this far, you can go try out. And just a couple of months later, Roy Benavidez was a Green Beret. A year later, in 1968, so 4 years after Roy was nearly killed by that landmine, he was sent back to Vietnam for his second combat tour. And as soon as he got there, the fighting was very intense. On May 2nd of that year, Roy had a day off, and he was spending his day off at a church service inside of their wooden shack they had built on their base. And while he was in there listening to the chaplain, he heard a radio call come out from the communications table that was just outside of the shack he was in, and it sounded like someone was in trouble. And so he ran outside to listen to the radio, and what he heard was this very desperate call from someone yelling into the radio, get us out of here. And in the background of this radio call is just a constant barrage of gunfire. The call for help came from a 12-man Army Special Forces team that had been ambushed by an entire North Vietnamese Army infantry battalion. To put that in perspective, that is 12 Special Forces members, of which many of them Roy knew personally, in the middle of the jungle, where on all four sides there are over 1,000 enemy combatants. As Roy is hearing this distressing transmission come across the radio, he hears overhead the sound of incoming helicopters. And he looks and he sees there's 3 birds that are coming towards their base. And so he runs over to the landing zone to greet the helicopters as they come in. And he can see as they're landing, they are all completely covered in bullet holes. And as soon as they touch down, Roy runs up to one of the door gunners, which is this 19-year-old kid. And he looks kind of dazed. And Roy asks him, what's going on? Where'd you guys just come from? Were you out there at that ambush site? Do you know what's going on with that 12-man team? And the door gunner just collapses into Roy's arms and dies. He had been shot up. These 3 helicopters had attempted previously to fly into the jungle and save that 12-man team, but they had been shot off and had been unsuccessful. Roy helped get the dead door gunner out of the helo, and then he turned to the pilot of this helo where the door gunner was, and he asked him, are you going to go back out there and try to save those guys? And the pilot was obviously so distraught about the death of his door gunner, and also the fact that there are 12 men out there that they could not rescue, that he's chomping at the bit. He wants to go back out there. And Roy immediately volunteers, hops in the helo, and they head out to go rescue this 12-man team. So not only are there only 2 of them, but Roy was so eager to volunteer himself, he forgot his gun. So all he had on him was his knife and some medical supplies. But nonetheless, the pilot just keeps flying towards the ambush site, which was in Cambodia. It was this really dense stretch of jungle. And as they got closer and closer, gunfire started coming out of the jungle towards the helicopter. And so the pilot had to do this kind of constant zigzagging just to avoid getting shot down. And so as they're zigzagging, they notice there's some smoke coming out of the jungle. And it was very clear that this 12-man team is trying to signal to the helo, here we are, come get us, because they can hear the helicopters coming in. And so the pilot tried to fly down and get as close as he could, but anytime he got even marginally close to this team, the rate of fire would pick up so dramatically that the helo was just about to get shot down. And so the pilot began to turn away, and he told Roy, we can't get any closer, we're gonna have to get more people in here. And Roy just tells him, no, get as low as you can, and I will jump out into the jungle. And the pilot turns to him and he's like, you can't do that, you're gonna get killed. And Roy somehow convinces this pilot that he alone, without a gun, is totally competent. Just put me down in that jungle and everything's gonna be just fine. And so the pilot said, okay, and he lowered right over the canopy of this jungle, about 100 yards away from where this 12-man team is trapped. And without any hesitation, Roy just leaps off the helicopter into the jungle. Now, you got to understand that where he was jumping was where the enemy was. He was literally jumping, no parachute, no gun, no anything, just crashing through the canopy onto the jungle floor where he'll definitely be surrounded by enemy combatants. And so he plummets through the canopy, he smashes onto the ground, he pops up and just starts running through the jungle with enemies on either side of him towards the 12-man down team. And the enemy was so surprised to just see this American running through the middle of the jungle by himself with no weapon that they hesitated for a minute and they didn't open fire on him. But when they did open fire, Roy got shot in the face, in the back of the head, in the leg. They threw a grenade that detonated at his back and sent shrapnel into him, but none of it stopped Roy. He just kept on running until he made it to this downed 12-man team. And when he got to them, they were in terrible shape. They were doing their best to stay behind some trees, but rounds were coming in from all directions, and 4 of them were already dead, and the others that were still alive were critically wounded. In fact, one of the most able-bodied of the surviving 12 had been shot in the head and was missing an eye and could barely see out of the other one. And so he's fighting to stay conscious, and he's generally trying to shoot in one direction. But I mean, that's their best guy at this point, to give you a state of how they were doing. But Roy ran up to this guy, he pulled him down, he gave him a shot of morphine in the arm, and he repositioned him because he couldn't really see, and told him where to shoot his gun. And then under a constant hail of bullets, Roy low-crawled to each of the other living team members and gave them morphine shots, and then began dragging each and every one of them away from the ambush site to this other area where there was better cover, and there was a nearby clearing that he believed a helicopter could land in if the pilot was really daring. On one of Roy's last trips back to the ambush site to get the last few surviving members, he saw 2 other men that were part of this team that had been totally cut off from the main group. And when Roy had jumped into the jungle and ran in, all his adrenaline had kicked up and he just hadn't done a head count. And so he didn't realize there were 2 other people over there. And so without any hesitation, he grabbed a gun off of one of the dead enemy soldiers and just began running towards this down 2-man team. And as he's running, he's shooting wildly in every direction, trying his best to suppress enemy fire, but it's really doing nothing. He's just dodging bullets as he's running. And right as he got close to the 2-man team, a bullet went flying through his thigh, just clean through his thigh, and it didn't slow him down. He got to the 2-man team totally unfazed, and he says, okay, get ready to move. He stands back up and he starts shooting again in both directions and tells them to crawl back to the main unit. And so he stands up and continues to shoot in both directions until these 2 men get back over to the main group. Once they were safely with the group, Roy again ran the gauntlet with this huge gaping hole in his thigh all the way back to the main group. And so now that Roy had a full head count of all of the living members of the downed 12-man team, and he had moved them all to this slightly safer area relatively with better cover and concealment, he threw a smoke grenade into the nearby clearing he had found in hopes that the helo pilot overhead would see the smoke and be willing to come down and land. The pilot that had dropped off Roy had not actually left the area. He had moved away from all the fighting, but he was loitering in case something like this happened. And so he saw the smoke, and without any hesitation, he flew right over, taking rounds the whole time, pinging off the side of his helicopter, and he touched down right in this tiny little clearing. And so as the semi-able-bodied surviving members of this unit began making their way over to the helicopter, Roy began running around a little ways off from the helicopter, picking up rifles off of the dead enemy and shooting back at the enemy, dropping that gun, running over, picking up another one, engaging the enemy over and over again, doing everything he can to try to protect the extract of his men behind him. And once Roy turned around and saw most of the men had made it onto the helicopter, Roy believed it was his chance now to run out and try to collect some of their dead teammates. And so Roy just takes off into the jungle, right into enemy fire. He's got 2 guns in his hands, and he's running. He's trying to engage the enemy as he's going, and then he comes across the first of his dead teammates, and it happens to be one of his very best friends, a man named Leroy Wright. And so he grabs Leroy and begins trying to haul him back towards the chopper, and as he's moving, Roy gets shot again, this time through his stomach. So he tries to keep himself on his feet, and as he's doing that, a grenade detonates behind him, sending more shrapnel into his body, knocking him unconscious. When he came to, he started looking around, and he could see in the tree line dozens of enemy soldiers running towards him. And so he knew if he tried to bring Leroy back to the chopper, that was a suicide mission. And so he had to leave his friend behind. He jumped up, and with all of these enemy combatants just constantly engaging him, he ran all the way back, zigging and zagging back to the main group. And when he got there, expecting to see the helicopter, he found the helicopter had actually crashed onto the ground and was on fire. It had been shot down while he was unconscious. And so he ran over to the flaming shell of this helicopter, and he saw the pilot had been killed, but some of the men that had climbed on, the men that he had just rescued, they had survived the crash and subsequent explosion. And so Roy just leaps into the burning vehicle and starts throwing these survivors out. Then he leapt back out, he picked up a gun, continued to engage the enemy, and then began picking up these wounded men and dragging them even farther away to another area that was safely away from this crash site, because he knew if he didn't get all these people away from the crash site, pretty soon mortars are going to come raining down on this area, because their enemy is going to want to kill any of the people that are going to try to rescue the people that were on the helicopter. And so Roy finally gets all of the survivors over to this new area, and he's looking around, and he can see there are still hundreds of enemy fighters that are not that far away from them, just constantly engaging them. And Roy's doing his best to grab guns off the ground and shoot the enemy, but there's just too many of them. And he's looking around at his team, and everybody's on the brink of death. And so is Roy. He's just functioning on adrenaline at this point, and he thinks to himself, the only way we can get out of this is if we call in what's called a danger close airstrike. So what you need to understand about how airstrikes work in a combat zone is there's someone called a controller that is on the ground directing the aircraft overhead. They're the ones effectively telling the plane where to shoot. And so a danger close airstrike is when the controller tells the aircraft overhead, I want you to drop a bomb right here, giving them the grid coordinates, but where they're telling them to drop is basically in the same position where the controller is. And you'd only do it if you're being overrun. It's a way to ensure your enemy gets taken out, even if that means taking yourself out. Now, the goal of the controller is not to drop the bomb on themselves or their team. The goal of the controller is to get that airstrike as close as you can to your position without killing you. And so Roy, who's physically wrecked, he's getting shot at, he's got bullet holes all over him, it's totally chaotic. He pulls out his map, he calmly finds his grid coordinates, he calls it into the aircraft overhead, and he calls in a beautiful precision napalm strike. It does not affect his team at all. He calls in multiple gun runs. None of them affect his team, despite them all being considered danger close airstrikes. And so Roy just continuously called in attack run after attack run, taking out enemy combatants all around them, completely suppressing the fire. But at some point, the aircraft overhead ran out of fuel and had to leave. And at that point, the surviving enemy combatants, which still numbered in the hundreds, they popped their heads up and they unleashed a hellacious volley of fire in which Roy again got shot clean through the leg. And so now Roy's looking around and he's realizing they're pretty much out of options. They don't have aircraft overhead. Roy's basically out of ammunition and there's no dead guys' guns around for him to grab. All of his team members are basically on the brink of death. And so Roy's thinking to himself, any minute now, we're going to get overrun. And so he crawls to each of his surviving teammates and he gives them one last shot of morphine to at least make their death painless. And then at the 11th hour, another helo comes blazing into the jungle and opens fire on the enemy, pushing them back. Roy is immediately invigorated and motivated because now he sees an opportunity to potentially survive this. And so once again, he grabs his teammates and begins schlepping them over to the helicopter. And after he believed he got the last of them on board, he turned and saw two of his teammates had fallen down farther back in the jungle and the enemy was closing in on them. And so Roy, like always, without any hesitation, just starts running towards them. And as he's just about to reach them, an enemy soldier that had apparently run out of ammunition leapt out of the jungle and smashed Roy on the side of the head with their rifle butt, fracturing his skull. And so Roy falls to the ground, and the soldier jumps on top of him and smashes his face, breaking his jaw. And then the soldier turns his rifle around. There's a bayonet on the front side, and he begins impaling Roy over and over again. And Roy, like out of a movie, grabbed the rifle, pulled it out of himself, threw the soldier on the ground, jumped up, got on top of him, drew his Bowie knife, and proceeded to kill this soldier. And after he was done with that, he ran over to the two downed men. He grabbed one of them with his left hand. He picked up a rifle with the other. And as he's dragging this guy back to the chopper, he shoots and kills two more enemy combatants. So he finally gets this guy back to the chopper. He runs back, gets the last guy, throws him back in the helicopter. And then finally, Roy is the very last living American to hop in the helicopter, and the helicopter takes off. On the helo ride back, Roy was in very rough shape and had to literally hold his insides inside of his stomach. And so when they finally landed back at base and Roy was hauled off of this helicopter, he wasn't moving, and the doctors and nurses didn't really even know where to start with him. He had so many injuries. He had 37 significant holes in his body from gunshot wounds, from bayonet wounds, from shrapnel. And so they started trying to treat him, but there was no heartbeat, no pulse. And so they declared him dead. Roy's body was moved into a body bag, and as the doctor was zipping it up again, Roy spit in his face because Roy had no other way to communicate. His jaw was so badly broken from that rifle butt, he couldn't move his jaw, and his eyes were sealed shut from all the blood on his face that had dried. And so his only way to communicate was to spit. And so unbelievably, Roy was still alive. And so they took him out of the body bag and they shipped him to Japan for intensive surgery. And then he was transferred to Texas, where he spent a year rehabbing from his severe injuries. Roy was immediately given the Distinguished Service Cross and was put in for the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is the U.S. military's highest award for valor. But the paperwork took a really long time. And so Roy was not actually given the Congressional Medal of Honor until 1981. Of the 12 men that were trapped in that jungle, 8 would survive, all thanks to Roy Benavidez.
Thank you. Thank you. A lot of people call me a hero. I appreciate the title. But the real heroes are the ones that gave their life for this country.
Roy passed away in 1998 as a result of complications from diabetes. He was 63 years old. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please take out all of the like button's trash bags from their trash cans and then proceed to throw various perishable saucy foods inside. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today's story really has just a wild plot twist. And that's kind of what we do on this channel. We look for stories with crazy plot twists. This is a big one. So the story opens with these officers, these police officers in Lebanon that have been sent to this beach to go investigate this strange object on the sand. And they go to this object and they're sort of bewildered by it. And as the story progresses, you have a pretty good idea of what this is, why it happened, and likely what's going to be the outcome. But then at the very end of the story, when you're like, yeah, this is pretty predictable, it just goes completely into left field. And you're going to be left being like, I've never heard a story like that. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and take all their ball caps and fold the bill into Mickey Mouse ears. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. One night in late January of 1965, a police officer named Fareed Jaber, along with another officer, his partner, were walking along a beach in Antilias, Lebanon, which is a tiny village just north of Beirut. The weather was absolutely terrible. It was freezing out, it was pouring rain, and it's nighttime, so it's dark out. I mean, this is a pretty nasty time to be out, walking around. As much as Fareed and very likely his partner would have desperately liked to have been home in bed right now, they knew that, they both needed this job, especially Fareed. It paid well and he couldn't afford to lose it, and so sometimes doing this job, being a cop, was pretty uncomfortable, and he'd sort of just accepted that. Now, the reason that Fareed and his partner were out here right now patrolling this beach in this terrible weather was because somebody had called in and said that they saw something odd on the beach, and they thought maybe it could be a dead body, or it could just be a body, period. They didn't know, but there was something odd on the beach. And so the police were called to go have a look. Now, this part of Lebanon was considered pretty safe. So, the idea of bodies turning up sort of out on the beach or out, in public anywhere was just sort of unheard of. And so Fareed and his partner really didn't expect to walk up on a dead body or something. In fact, Fareed really just expected to find some dead sea creature or something, or maybe some trash, he didn't know what. But, as he's walking along with his jacket pulled around tight and he's scanning the beach with his flashlight, battling the weather, he just felt kind of annoyed that they were out here. Like, this is going to be nothing. Like, why are we even being called out here? There's no way there's literally a body on the beach right now. But sure enough, as Fareed and his partner continued walking along the beach, looking around with their flashlights, far down the beach, right in the middle of the sand, they did see this odd object just laying out on the sand. And even at first glance, from a distance, it did look human-like. It definitely had the form where it could be a person. And so right away, Fareed and his partner are like, clearly that's what was called in. This is what we're here to investigate. Now, the two of them didn't run over to whatever this was. They have no idea what's going on here. I mean, if this really is a person, they don't know why they're here, if there's somebody that hurt them that's in the vicinity. So they're playing it safe. They're walking up slowly, scanning the whole beach, looking for any other indication of, whatever this is. Maybe there's other things that are odd on the beach, but there was nothing. It was just this odd body-like thing on the sand. But as they got closer, Fareed in particular, he's looking at this object and he's like, that is definitely a person. I can tell that's a body on the ground. But there was just something odd about the body. It just looked off. There was just something unnatural about it. There's something that he couldn't put his finger on, but he's gonna find out when he gets close. And so Fareed and his partner, they get closer and closer, and both their flashlights are trained on this human-like thing, and then finally they're standing right over it, and they look down, and for sure, this is a person. But they could now see, now that they're right up close, why this person seemed off. And it was because this body was missing its head. Now, right away, it seemed fairly apparent to Fareed and his partner that this body, one, belonged to a man, and two, very likely they did not die of like an accidental drowning and get washed up on shore or something. Very likely, especially because of the decapitation, this man was murdered. Somebody killed him and likely dumped him here, or maybe dumped him in the water and then he washed up here. But this is foul play. And so Fareed and the partner, they're like, okay, we got to search the area, do a cursory search, and just make sure, whoever did this isn't just nearby. We need to secure the scene. And so they drew their guns and they walked the area, but there was nobody else there. The beach is totally, desolate, minus this body and the police officers. And so after doing that cursory search and coming back to the body, Fareed and his partner began talking about what they were gonna do. Now remember, this is the mid-1960s in a small rural village in Lebanon. So this is not like a robust police department that Fareed and his partner were a part of. They did not have, huge resources to process this, vicious homicide, or at least what it looked to be, a vicious homicide. They didn't even have radios to call in backup. I mean, they knew at best what they'd be able to do here is maybe by tomorrow, they could have a couple more officers come out and begin to investigate and see what happened here. But just to do that, it would require literally going back to the station and rallying support and explaining what's going on and coming up with a plan and going out and doing that. And so as they're sort of talking through what they should do, because again, also remember, this is not an area where homicides take place either. I mean, this is pretty anomalous. So they don't even necessarily know how to process a homicide, but they say, okay, our best bet is one of us just needs to stay here with the body, basically guard the crime scene. And the other will go back to the station and file the paperwork and get this machine in motion so that tomorrow we can actually begin investigating. So basically, one of them would have to stay the night, literally on the beach in the freezing cold and the rain next to this dead body to make sure nobody came back to claim it or desecrate it in some way. And as they're talking about who was going to do that, Fareed was the more junior officer, and so pretty quickly it became clear that he was going to have to do it. And again, going back to the earlier part in the story where Fareed, he knew this job could be very uncomfortable sometimes, but he needed this job. He needed the income. He couldn't afford to lose this job. And so when it was sort of clear this was going to be his doing, he said, fine, I'll stay here. I'll stay with the body. You go, get the investigation started, and I'll see you tomorrow. Now, after Fareed's partner had left and had walked down the beach and disappeared, Fareed sort of realized just how bad this night was going to be. I mean, think about it. Not only is the weather awful, but he's literally, sitting next to a decapitated body. He's going to be just, in the company of this dead body all night. And on top of that, he suspects that somebody has killed this guy. This guy's been murdered. And maybe this body has been dumped here by the murderer. And even though they did a cursory search, it wasn't 100% certain that the killer or killers were not somewhere in the area. And so Fareed's thinking okay, I have to guard the body and be careful not to get attacked by the killer who could be, nearby. I mean, this is straight out of a nightmare. But, at the same time, Fareed's thinking to himself, I'm a trained police officer. I have my issued gun and my issued knife. I'm not completely defenseless here. If somebody were to come out here and attack me, I could hold my own. I could defend myself. And so he's at least telling himself that. And so as the rain continues to just pound down on Fareed, he's shivering, he's miserable. He knows he's supposed to be alert and, watching this crime scene. He's not supposed to sleep, but he's so uncomfortable that he finds himself getting down on the sand and kind of, getting into the fetal position, trying to find a little bit of comfort. And at some point he does get a little comfortable, in fact, so comfortable that despite how awful it was outside, he did fall asleep at about maybe 2, 3 in the morning. And so Fareed falls asleep, and then a few hours later, he wakes up and he's in a panic because he knows he wasn't supposed to fall asleep. He's supposed to be guarding this crime scene to make sure nobody touches this body. And also remember, he thinks the killer could be out here, it's an actual real possibility they might come back and do something to the body. And he's just fallen asleep. And so he kind of scrambles to his feet. He's taking stock of the scene. It's still raining. It's still cold and dark out. And he turns and he looks where the body was supposed to be, and it's gone. The body is gone. And so instinctively, he's thinking, oh, the killer's nearby. They must have grabbed the body. He reaches for his gun, and his holster's empty. And so now it's truly a nightmare scenario for Fareed. He was supposed to be here to watch the crime scene, and he allowed the body to be taken, and he's been disarmed. Now, fortunately, he had his, service knife, and he pulled that out. That's all he's got at this point. But he's thinking, I'm screwed. What happened? Where did it go? Where'd the body go? Where'd my gun go? What do I do? And so he starts thinking, well, wait a minute, maybe an animal came by and grabbed the body and dragged the body, and it's nearby. And he's sort of looking up and down the beach, and he's thinking, it could be pretty far away, but he sees there's no drag marks. There's no way the body could have been dragged by an animal. And then also an animal came back and unclipped his holster and took his gun out and took that away. That doesn't make any sense. He would have at least woken up if that was happening. But then he's well, wait a minute, maybe a wave came up and grabbed the body and dragged it into the ocean. That's why it's not here. That's why there's no drag marks. But he looked at where he was sleeping, and almost certainly if the body had been struck with a big wave that dragged it into the ocean, Fareed would have been hit by that same wave, and he would have woken up. And then also, again, who took his gun? And so the realization hit Fareed that the only explanation here is a person came over here while I was asleep, took the body, took my gun, and now they're gone. So the night before, Fareed, the officer who was, left on the beach to guard the scene, the one who fell asleep, Fareed, his cousin, a man named Habib Jaber, had been walking along the beach alone when he had been attacked. This man had robbed him and then killed him and decapitated him. And he had left Habib's body on the shore. but he had taken his head and the money he had stolen from him back to his home. But several hours later, the killer realized maybe it had been a mistake to leave so much evidence behind, namely leaving behind the headless body. Maybe that could get them in trouble. So they decide, okay, I'm gonna go back and get the body and bring it here as well to get rid of the evidence. But when the killer got back to the beach, back to the crime scene, he saw the body was now being guarded by a police officer. And that police officer was Fareed. Now, it's very important that you understand that Fareed, the officer, had no idea that the body he was guarding belonged to his cousin. All he knew was that this was a man who was killed. But because he was missing his head, he had not been able to identify him as his cousin. He just thought it was some stranger, some man had been killed, not his cousin. Now, when the killer got to the beach, he was about to turn around because he sees, I can't do anything because, this officer is guarding the body. What can I do? But he snuck up a little bit closer and he realized the police officer, Fareed, he had fallen asleep on the job. And so while Fareed was sleeping, the killer did walk up, pick up the body, carry it off to his house, which was not far away. And he also went back and he took Fareed's gun out of his holster, all while Fareed was asleep. So literally the worst thing that Fareed thought could have happened, that he was basically duped by the killer while he slept, did happen. So after the killer has taken the body and the gun away from Fareed and he's back at his home down the beach, he decided what he would do is he would start a big fire and he would dispose of the body that way. He would burn it in the fire and that would get rid of all the evidence and he'd be just fine. And so as the killer is chopping up firewood, basically at the end of the beach, not far from Fareed, believe it or not, he's chopping up all this firewood, Fareed wakes up in a panic, realizing, oh my gosh, the body's gone, my gun's gone, what do I do? And Fareed turns and he sees there's this man at the end of the beach who's chopping wood. Now, Fareed has no idea that man is actually literally the killer of his cousin. He has no idea. He just thinks it's some random dude who lives at the end of this beach who's chopping wood. But Fareed, he's so desperate to salvage his job, he's gotta find this body, he's gotta find his gun. He's thinking, man, this guy, he lives so close to the crime scene, maybe he saw something strange. Maybe he can help me find the body and my gun. And so Fareed walks on down the beach, not realizing he's about to come face to face with his cousin's killer. Fast forward several hours, and Fareed's partner finally returns to the beach, now with a team of detectives, and they're ready to investigate. And Fareed's partner, at first glance, looks down to the sand and he sees, one person standing there next to what appears to be a headless body on the ground, and he thinks, okay, there's Fareed and there's the body. The scene is the same as it was when I left it. But when they got a little bit closer, Fareed's partner started to notice something. The body on the ground, it had the wrong clothes on. They're different than what the body had on last night. What's going on here? This discrepancy would be made clear once Fareed's partner got down right next to the body and really got a look at it. He saw clearly the body is not the same as the night before. It's not just the clothes. Fareed's partner didn't know this, but it's not Fareed's cousin. That's not who this is. But the body also did not belong to Fareed either. Fareed was standing right next to the body. In fact, it would turn out really nothing about the scene that Fareed's partner found on the beach that morning was what it appeared to be at first glance. He and the rest of the team had to spend the rest of the morning searching the beach and the entire neighboring village and conducting countless interviews with potential witnesses to finally put it all together and make sense of it. And by the end of that day, the story that they managed to put together was so totally bizarre that it made headlines all over the world. Because Fareed was so desperate to keep his job, when he walked down the beach to go talk to that man chopping wood to see if he knew anything about what happened to the body, where did it go, did you see anything strange? As he was talking to this guy, again, not knowing it is literally the killer of your cousin. Fareed doesn't know this. He thinks it's a complete stranger. Fareed starts having this idea. He's like, well, wait a minute. I have my knife. What if I kill this man? No one's here. Cut his head off and put his body over there. No one will know. I'll replace the body. And so that's what Fareed did. He murdered this man, believing it was just some random guy to save his job. He's standing there when the partner comes down and he's like, look, I guarded the body. But it wasn't the body. It was a guy he murdered to save himself, but it just so happened to be that the guy he murdered was literally the killer of his cousin. Had no idea. And so even though in sort of a roundabout, backwards, vigilante way, justice was done here, Fareed took out the killer of his own cousin, even though that did technically happen, Fareed was still arrested for murder. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell you two stories that really have shock endings. I mean, the plot twists in both these stories are absolutely worth waiting for. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So, if that's of interest to you, please remove the batteries from the like button's TV remote, and then once they're out, go ahead and use super glue and glue the back on. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the night of May 3rd, 1897, a 43-year-old widow named Mary Titus lay in her bed inside of her house in the small town of Plymouth, Pennsylvania. And Mary, as she laid there, she just could not fall asleep because she kept hearing this strange tapping sound coming from somewhere in her house. Eventually, Mary just stopped trying to fall asleep altogether, and she just sat up and just listened really intently to figure out, where the sound is coming from. But she just couldn't do it. It was sort of erratic, and it seemed like it was coming from all over the house, and at one point it felt like it was right below her, and then it was over here. I mean, it really was hard to pinpoint where it was even coming from, let alone what was actually causing it. And then on top of that, the volume of this tapping was also changing. Sometimes it would get really loud, and then it would be super faint, and she could barely hear it. But it was still there, somewhere in her house. But then, sort of inexplicably, the tapping sound just abruptly stopped. Mary is sitting up in bed, it's 2, 3 in the morning, and it's just silence in her house. And at that point, Mary told herself, okay, well, clearly it was some animal, or maybe it's a branch tapping on the outside of her house or something. She's rationalizing the sound. It's gone now, so it can't be harmful, and I should just stop thinking about it and actually go to sleep now. But shortly after laying her head back down on the pillow, when she was almost asleep, she started hearing this sound again. And again, she just could not tell where it was coming from. Now, Mary, she was a widow, but she did have somebody else who lived with her in the house. It was her daughter, her 18-year-old daughter, whose name was Cora. Cora's father and Mary's husband had passed away tragically 11 years earlier in this terrible mining explosion. And really, even though it had been 11 years, Mary and Cora were still very much living in the shadow and the grief of, his death. This is something that they really had never been able to move past. And so as Mary is laying here in bed and she's hearing this tapping sound starting again, part of her thinks maybe it's Cora, maybe she's doing something. But really, what was going through her head when this tapping sound began again was how utterly alone she felt and how badly she missed her husband. Like, she really just wished he was here, because then she would have told him, hey, go investigate. I'm going to stay here. You go make sure the house is safe. But obviously he was gone. He'd been gone for over a decade. And so eventually, even though Mary really didn't want to get up and go look for this tapping sound, because truthfully, she was just scared at this point, but she's thinking about her daughter, Cora, who's downstairs, and heaven forbid there's some problem in the house. Maybe an animal has literally gotten into the house and it could be hazardous. She doesn't know. So she needs to go and be the brave one and go find out where the sound is coming from and make sure her daughter's okay. And on top of that, her daughter, Cora, had recently had this really bad case of strep throat. And while she was recovering, she really was not back to 100%. And so Mary told herself, this is an opportunity as much as anything to go down and just check on her daughter and make sure she's okay. And so finally, Mary musters the courage and she takes her sheets off and she gets up out of her bed. And at the same time, the tapping is sort of rocketing all around the house. It's all over the place. And right as Mary steps onto the ground, she's out of her bed, the tapping stops. Mary starts walking towards the door and there's nothing. She gets to the door, she opens it up, she listens, she's looking out, but there's nothing. and the house is completely silent. And there was something kind of eerie about it. It's like the sound was responding to Mary's actions. And suddenly all of Mary's courage evaporated. And she thought, you know what? The sound has stopped. Everything's okay. I'm sure Cora's okay. I'm getting back in bed and I'm going to sleep. And that's what she did. She rushed back to her bed. She did not go check on Cora. She just got under the sheets, pulled him up to her chin, and just hoped the sound wouldn't come back. And it didn't. And eventually, Mary fell asleep. The following morning, when Mary woke up, she immediately kind of took stock and realized, okay, I'm okay. Everything seems fine in the house. She listened and didn't hear any knocking sounds. And she quickly got up, she got dressed, she went downstairs into the kitchen, and Cora was actually already down there doing some needlepoint, and she seemed perfectly fine, albeit still recovering from her strep throat. But she was okay. She was in the kitchen in good spirits. And so Mary just kind of, breathed a sigh of relief here. Even though, again, she really has no idea what that tapping was. She has no idea if it was sinister or not. This could be totally benign. But there was just something uneasy about it. And so it was just really nice to come down here and have life be totally normal. And so pretty quickly, Mary just fell into her everyday routine. She began prepping some food for her and Cora to eat, and then she and her daughter just started chatting. At no point did Mary bring up the tapping sound, in part because she didn't really even know what they meant. She was kind of spooked by it, didn't want to scare her daughter, so it never came up. But they're chatting, having their completely normal morning, when suddenly there's very clear and fairly loud tapping that starts not in the kitchen, but below the kitchen, in the cellar. And as soon as the tapping starts, Mary immediately stops because she recognized it as the same sounds she was hearing the night before that spooked her so badly. And she looked over at Cora without saying anything, just seeing if maybe Cora heard the noises too. And Cora as well is looking at her mom like, did you hear that? And Mary's like, you heard that too? You heard that tapping? And Cora's like, yeah, I think it's coming from the cellar. And Mary, she's like, I could have sworn I heard that tapping last night. It was actually keeping me up. And Cora, she said, well, it sounds like it's in the cellar. Maybe we have mice down there and they're rummaging around or something. That's probably what it is. And so Mary, who at this point is desperate to find a logical, non-scary explanation for what's going on here, just immediately goes down the stairs into the cellar and begins looking for mice. That would prove that's all this is. It's mice making these sounds. But when she's down there, she's looking around and there's no mice, there's no sign of mice. And as she's down there, she starts hearing the tapping again. But now it's not coming from the cellar where they thought the sounds were originating. It's coming from somewhere above her. And as soon as Mary hears this tapping sound, she hears Cora reacting to it upstairs in the kitchen, like she was kind of startled by it. And so Mary runs back upstairs to the kitchen. She looks at Cora, and Cora is visibly distressed because she's like, I heard it. It was in here. It was in the kitchen or somewhere nearby. I didn't see anything, but I heard it. As soon as you went down there, I heard it. And so at this point, Mary is undeniably scared. She doesn't know what this is, but it's gotten to the point where she cannot deny there is something strange happening in her house. Her daughter has now fully corroborated that. And so Mary said, you know what? I'm going next door. They had a friend who lived next door, a guy that actually used to work with Mary's husband, who was sort of like their handyman and the guy they would call on to kind of help them around the house. And so Mary, she left her house and she went next door, knocked on this guy's door. And when he came, she explained that there's something happening. There's knocking sounds happening in my house. It's scaring me and Cora. We can't figure out what it is. Can you please come take a look? And he was like, absolutely. I'll be over in a second. And so Mary goes back to her house and she and Cora are standing in the kitchen and periodically they're hearing these tapping sounds. And then the neighbor, he comes over. He comes inside and right away, when he comes in, he starts to hear the tapping too. And Mary's like, what is that? And Cora, she's totally spooked. And the guy's like, I think it's your pipes. I think that's all this is. It sounds very much like your pipes are banging against the wood inside your house or something. So let me just check your plumbing. That's probably what this is. And so Mary and Cora, they're like, great. Like, he seems pretty confident that that's all this is. And so Mary and Cora, they kind of hover around the neighbor as he begins to check the kitchen and the bathroom plumbing. But as he's checking all the pipes and the fittings and kind of looking for the origin of these strange tapping sounds, he realizes as he's checking all these different areas that as he's checking them, the tapping sound is persisting and it's not coming from the pipes. Sometimes it sort of seems like the tapping is coming from near the pipes, but other times, as he's working right here, the tapping sound is coming from somewhere else on the other side of the house. And eventually, Mary and Cora started to sense that the neighbor, who had come in very confident that this was no big deal, was starting to show signs that he too felt a little uncomfortable, like something was off here. And then, sort of out of nowhere, when the tapping got really loud, and it was now apparent, not only to this guy, but also to Mary and Cora, that the tapping could not be coming from the plumbing, because it's nowhere near here, it's behind us. And the man, he turned around and he looked at Mary and Cora. His face is ashen, he really looked pretty upset. And he said, the last time I heard this sound was in the mine. It was when your husband was killed in that explosion. He died, but other men got trapped in the mine behind all this rubble from the explosion, and they couldn't get out. And they were tapping on the rocks over and over again until they all died. That's what this sounds like. After that, the man just got up and hastily left and just told them, "I'm sorry, I can't help you." And he was out the door and back over to his house. And so Mary and Cora, they're left wondering, what do we even do? Who do we talk to? What's happening here? But for Mary specifically, even though she couldn't believe that this guy had just told her that, what a horrible thing to tell her. I mean, he knows she's grieving the loss of her husband. How could you possibly say that to me? But she's thinking about what he told her. That it sounds like the tapping of these doomed men, including her husband, tapping on the mine walls before they perished. And she started to wonder, what if these are ghosts? What if it's my husband and these men who died in the mines 11 years ago, trying to get my attention? What if they're trying to communicate with me? Over the next 4 days, the tapping sound inside of their house continued. And the story about what was happening here spread all across town. In fact, all sorts of neighbors and actually news outlets were coming to Mary and Cora's house to hear the tapping sounds for themselves. And when they'd come in the house, Mary would walk them around the house. And sure enough, the reporters, the neighbors, they'd all hear the tapping sounds. And nobody could explain it. It was like this unbelievable phenomenon. And Mary and Cora, by this point, they were convinced that these sounds were very likely Mary's dead husband and the other men who perished in the mine. Finally, on May 9th, so 6 days after this haunting began, by this point, the story is out in newspapers, people are talking about it all over the place, and in some ways that legitimized Mary and Cora's plight. But they also really didn't know what to do about this. This had become sort of a spectacle, but nobody had any solutions for them. So Mary and Cora, they're sitting at the table weighing out their options. What do we even do? Even if this is, our dead husband, our dead father trying to communicate with us, we can't live with this. This is kind of terrifying. And if it just goes on and on, do we eventually move? And so they're having that kind of discussion. And as they're sitting at the kitchen table, suddenly the tapping starts again. Except now, the tapping sound is so close. It's practically on top of Mary and Cora, so much so that their conversation immediately stopped when this tapping started. And they both kind of looked at each other like, it's right on top of us, what's going on? And then as this tapping continued, they realized it was basically right below them, almost like in the cellar, right underneath them. And so Mary sort of reflexively leaned back in her chair, just kind of trying to get out of, the bubble of this really intimate, close tapping sound that they were in. And as she's sitting back, she saw something she had never noticed before. And immediately, she understood what was going on. It would turn out the tapping sounds that were plaguing Mary and Cora were not being caused by Mary's dead husband or the other men that died in the mines 11 years ago. However, the actual origin of these tapping sounds was in some ways equally as bizarre. So Cora had recently had a bad case of strep throat, and she was doing better, but she still was feeling kind of under the weather. And that was in part because the bacteria that causes strep throat was still in her system. And that same bacteria is also responsible for causing a totally different condition known as Sydenham's chorea, which Cora also had. In fact, she had it likely at the same time that she had strep throat. And Sydenham's chorea has a very different set of symptoms to strep throat. This condition, which is also known as the dancing plague, causes your body to have these involuntary movements that the person who has this condition is often totally unaware of. These people can flail around suddenly and not even know they're doing it. And so what was happening is Cora was making the tapping sound, but had no idea she was making the tapping sound because it was being caused by Synonym's Korea. Now, it seems like, well, how didn't Mary catch on that her own daughter is tapping her feet or flicking her hand and causing this tapping sound? Well, the reality was, when the tapping first started, a lot of times Mary was not in the same room as her daughter. And her daughter did not know she was making the tapping sounds. So her daughter is genuinely scared of the tapping sounds because she doesn't know she's making them. And Mary doesn't know it's her daughter making them. And so combined, they're like, oh my gosh, what's happening in our house? And then before long, they had kind of gone down this path of, it's my dead husband, it's my dead father, he's the one making these sounds. And then it's like they had tunnel vision, as did all the other neighbors, as did the reporters. Everybody wanted this in some ways to be a haunting. And so nobody's checking to see if maybe Cora is tapping her feet or hands and creating these tapping sounds. Because again, Cora was fully convinced she was not making those sounds. But then finally, when she and her mom were sitting at the table discussing what they were gonna do 6 days after the haunting began, and they hear this really intense, close tapping sound, when Mary kind of leaned back to kind of take stock of the room and figure out what was going on, she noticed under the table Cora's foot stomping on the ground. Cora didn't know it was Synonym's Korea. One afternoon in November of 2021, a middle-aged woman named Nicole Petit was on break at her job in the city of Decatur, Alabama. And while she was sitting in the break room, she pulled out her phone and she called her 21-year-old daughter, Hannah. The phone rang a couple of times, then eventually Hannah picked up, and right away, Nicole could tell her daughter, Hannah, was still very much not feeling well. She could hear it clearly in her voice. So Nicole's daughter was a stay-at-home mom to two very young kids, which, was totally exhausting in its own right. And in fact, on this phone call, Nicole could hear in the background the sound of the kids yelling and running around and crashing into things, so clearly it was just chaos over there. But Nicole knew Hannah could not just be tired from tending to her kids, because over the last couple of months, what Nicole had noticed was every time she spoke to her daughter, whether her daughter's kids were going crazy or not, Hannah just completely sounded under the weather. And in fact, Hannah often was complaining, again, over the past few months, of not only feeling a deep exhaustion, but also of feeling really dizzy and nauseous. Now, over the past few months, Nicole had been telling her daughter, you have to go see a doctor. This is not normal. This is not just parenting fatigue. Something is off. You need to go get looked at. But Hannah, who was known to be very, very tough and, generally didn't really go to the doctor much, she said to her mom, I'm fine, I'm just exhausted from the kids, it's no big deal. And so she kind of pushed that idea aside. And so this time, as Nicole's talking to her daughter, and she can clearly hear that her daughter is not better, she's still feeling awful, she knew trying to push her daughter to go see the doctor wasn't gonna work. So instead, she said, okay, Hannah, when's Brian gonna be home? Brian was Hannah's husband. And Hannah just sighed and she said, no, he's not home yet, I don't know when he's gonna be here. So for the most part, Brian was, a very active parent and husband, but he also was a very successful chiropractor. And in fact, he had had so much success at his private practice that recently he'd even been able to fully renovate his building. And so with this new building and all this extra space and all this new staff, he was working even more than usual, which, financially was great for the family. But it meant he basically was absent all the time. And so it had become kind of commonplace that Brian was nowhere to be seen. It was kind of Hannah alone with the kids and this mystery illness she was suffering from. Now, Nicole obviously understood the nuance here. She knew that, Brian's practice was very important, not just to him, but to Hannah and their family. And so instead of, being upset with Brian, Nicole had tried very hard to make herself available to her daughter, to take care of her kids, to help her out whenever she could. But there was a limit to how much Nicole could help, because Nicole also worked full time. And so she couldn't just be around all the time to help with her daughter. Like today, she was working. She wished she wasn't, so she could go be with her daughter, but that was just the way it was. For the next couple of minutes, Nicole and Hannah just chatted like mother and daughter. And then at some point towards the end of the call, like Nicole always did, she told her daughter, hey, I really think you ought to go to the doctor. If you tell me what day you're gonna go and you make an appointment, I'll go over and take care of your kids. I'll even take you to the appointment, whatever you need. Don't let logistics be the reason you don't see a doctor. Like, whatever you need, you let me know and I will help you if I can. I'll flex my schedule to accommodate yours. But like Hannah always did, she just kind of brushed off her mom and said, okay, maybe I'll go see a doctor. I don't know, but I think I'm gonna be fine. I'm gonna rest, I'm gonna take vitamins, I'm gonna eat well, I'm gonna do all the things, and I'm sure this will pass. Nicole sighed when she heard this because basically she hears her daughter saying, I'm not going to the doctor still. But Nicole didn't argue. She just told her daughter that she loved her and she would see her soon, and then the two hung up. Over the next few weeks, Hannah continued to feel completely awful, nauseous, dizzy. All of her symptoms persisted and in some ways even got worse. But no matter how much pressure was put on her, namely by her mom, to go see a doctor, Hannah didn't. She really had convinced herself that this was just, parenting fatigue and that she would just get through it and she would be fine, which again was sort of very much her personality. She was this tough, hard-charging woman. She was going to just grit this one out. But then finally, in January of 2022, so now it's been months and months of Hannah having these symptoms and her mom basically begging her to go see a doctor. And by this point, Hannah can't argue with the fact that she is basically falling apart. She's lost so much weight, she actually can't even walk around her house anymore. She literally sits on a swivel chair, like a desk chair, and just pushes herself around the house. She is absolutely sick, and it's something that she can't even deny anymore. And so finally, in January of 2022, Hannah says, okay, Mom, I'll go to the hospital. Nicole, in some ways, was incredibly relieved that finally her daughter is doing the thing she should have done a long time ago. And then also, Nicole was just so annoyed with her daughter. Like, why didn't you go sooner? This is so silly. But regardless, Nicole's like, great. She tells her daughter, I'm gonna come over, pick you up, I'm gonna take you to the hospital, I'll be there with you. And so she goes over to Hannah's house, and when she gets there, Hannah in her chair wheels over to the door, and Hannah looks awful. She looks like she weighs less than 100 pounds, she's so pale, her hair looks like it's falling out. She looks absolutely sick. She looks like there's something seriously wrong with her. But Nicole, she just takes her daughter and assists her down the stairs, puts her in the car. She also gets her kids and brings them along as well, and they drive to the hospital. And when they get there, eventually Hannah is brought into an exam room along with Nicole and the kids, and a nurse comes in and they begin checking Hannah's vital signs and asking her some questions, and they also weighed Hannah. And eventually, after that was done, the nurse told Hannah that, hey, you only weigh 84 pounds. This is way below what's considered healthy. This is like an emergency. And based on the other things you're telling me about over the last few months having these symptoms, I'm worried you might actually have stomach cancer. Now, even though Nicole had anticipated that something seriously was wrong with her daughter, it still hit her like a freight train to hear that her 21-year-old daughter had stomach cancer. She'd never even heard of somebody that young having stomach cancer. And when Nicole looked over at her daughter, Hannah too was horrified. For her, she still believed this was all just gonna pass. Whatever this is, it'll go away. But obviously, stomach cancer is not something that just goes away. A couple minutes later, a doctor came in the room and explained to Hannah and Nicole that the next step here was to test Hannah to see if she actually had stomach cancer. Now, the doctor said it was entirely possible this could be something else. But again, based on all the symptoms you've described and the sudden extreme weight loss, unfortunately, this really does appear to be stomach cancer. But we're gonna check, and in a couple of days, we should have an answer. And so Nicole and Hannah, despite obviously being shocked and scared, they both said, whatever we need to do, that's what we're gonna do. A few days later, Nicole was at home when her phone rang, and it was her daughter calling. Now, to this point, Hannah had gone in and begun doing some of the tests to see if she had stomach cancer, and they were waiting for some of the results to come back. And so when Nicole saw this call coming in, she's thinking, oh my goodness, this could be it. I could be getting the call where Hannah has been told one way or the other about this being stomach cancer. And so with quite a bit of anxiety, Nicole answered the phone. And when she heard her daughter was not telling her about test results. Her daughter, she was speaking in such a low tone that she could barely hear her, but she basically croaked out to her mother that she felt so sick, she had to be taken to the hospital right now. And so Nicole, she dropped everything, sped over to her daughter's house. And when she found Hannah inside, it was like Hannah could barely move. She was so fatigued. She was so sick, so pale, so skinny and malnourished. It was like her daughter was dying. And so she scooped her daughter up and she rushed her to the hospital. Later that day, Hannah was in a hospital room and was stabilized. When she had come in, she actually was showing signs of what's called acute respiratory failure, which basically meant her lungs were shutting down. And in fact, one of her doctors had told Nicole that had Nicole not gone over there and rushed her daughter to the hospital on that day, very likely she would have died. She would not have survived another 24 hours at home. So this was as close as you can come to, your daughter dying. But they had been able to stabilize Hannah, and she was now resting in bed, and they were now trying to figure out what to do. And one of the doctors pulled Nicole aside and said, look, we know she's being tested for stomach cancer, and we don't know if she has that or not yet. But acute respiratory failure is not connected to stomach cancer. And on top of that, it's incredibly rare for someone as young as Hannah. So we really don't know what's going on here. All we can do is keep her here, keep her stable, monitor her, and run some additional tests. And so Nicole, she said, okay, let's do it. And so for a few days, that's what the medical staff did. They just continued to monitor and keep Hannah stable while testing her to figure out how somebody her age and in her condition could be contracting respiratory failure. But after a few days of this, out of nowhere, Hannah has this severe sudden seizure. But after her seizure passed, the medical staff began investigating Hannah's brain because a seizure is a brain-related event. And as they're looking into Hannah's brain, they discover that she has also contracted viral meningitis, which is inflammation of the membranes surrounding the brain. And generally speaking, viral meningitis is not life-threatening, but in rare cases, it can be. And considering the fact that Hannah had other very serious medical issues going on, and the fact that her particular viral meningitis case was very severe, doctors were worried that she could be someone who could die from this meningitis, or potentially have very serious brain damage if they didn't do something drastic to combat the swelling in her brain. And so a decision was made to put Hannah into a medically induced coma so that she would lay perfectly still and they could just wait for the swelling in her brain to go down. But what that meant functionally was that Hannah would be in this coma indefinitely until, the swelling goes down in her brain or who knows what. I mean, basically the doctors didn't know what was going on with her. However, just a couple of days after Hannah had been placed in this medically induced coma, some of her imaging tests came back from all the testing they had run on Hannah to try to figure out what was going on here. And in particular, there were these imaging tests that came back from her abdomen. They had scanned her abdomen. And what they discovered inside of her abdomen was truly shocking. Hannah's entire digestive tract was covered in white spots. And the doctors all knew that those spots were not cancer. They were something worse. And after running a few more tests to confirm their theory, once they had that information that, yep, what we suspect is going on here, they called the police. So remember Hannah's husband, Brian? He's the very successful chiropractor. Well, his practice had been so successful that he had had the funds to fully renovate his office and build this bigger, better chiropractic practice. And that was great, not just for him, but also for Hannah, her whole family. They were making money hand over fist. Everything was great. Except there was an issue. One of the upgrades that Brian wanted to do within this renovated space was to include an X-ray room. And when people build X-ray rooms, they actually line the walls of the room with these big sheets of lead to keep the radiation from penetrating the walls. But lead is incredibly toxic and harmful to humans, especially if you ingest it or you touch it. It's not something you really want to interact with at all. It needs to be kept at a safe distance. But after the renovations were done and the X-ray room was built, there were several sheets of lead that didn't make it into the walls. They were sort of extra sheets of lead that just didn't get used and they were out in the open. And when police discovered that and they began investigating, they found somebody had been shaving off pieces of those extra lead sheets, little bits of lead. They were shaving them off and planting them inside of Hannah's vitamins that she took religiously every day, believing those were the things that were going to make her healthy again. But in reality, sort of ironically, they were doing the opposite. She was literally poisoning herself every time she took one of those vitamins. And who was the person who was shaving off all that lead and literally trying to kill Hannah? Her own husband, Brian. All those white spots inside of Hannah's digestive tract were literally just pools of lead that had accumulated inside of her because her husband had been trying to poison her to death for months. Miraculously, though, Hannah would survive. After nearly 2 months in a medically induced coma, Hannah was healthy enough to be woken up and got to go back home with her kids. As for Brian, he was arrested, found guilty of attempted murder, and sentenced to life in prison. His motive was the $1.3 million in life insurance policies that he had taken out on Hannah. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.